If you ask me, you're already so old. It's time for you to get married. Noble ladies are more scheming. It's not bad to marry a peasant girl. She knew that Kim Yoon wouldn't care about these things, so she said this sincerely. Kim Yoon glared at her. You little girl, can't you act like a lady? What marriage? You're really shameless. With his charming appearance, he seemed to have turned into the world's #1 beauty and not the amiable Kim Yoon from before. Gong Yimo sighed. Before she could say anything, someone else came. The difference was that this time, it was someone from the palace. In an instant, the two people's expressions became serious. The emperor had decreed that he should immediately enter the palace for an audience. The eunuch who announced the decree looked at him eagerly. Kim Yoon immediately understood and handed over a purse. He then smiled and said in a strange voice, Your Highness should prepare as soon as possible. I heard that it's Liu Ye's honored guest. After saying that, he walked away arrogantly. His words surprised Kim Yoon. After the eunuch left, he called someone over and asked, Liu Yi, someone came. Why are you so quiet? Quickly go and investigate and come back to report. Yes. That person moved and hurriedly left. It seemed that he was a martial arts expert. Gong Yimo saw this. Although Kim Yoon's position was passive, he was rich and had a good character. He also had people who sincerely worked for him. Coupled with the convenience of his other identity, a lot of information that others couldn't find out couldn't reach his ears, so he wasn't so passive. After he changed his clothes, that person came back and said in a low voice, It's indeed Liu Ye's noble. Moreover, it's Liu Ye's Eagle King. His name is Rucha, but for some reason, King Liu Yi doesn't like him. Kim Yoon thought for a while and asked, Since it's a banquet, even if it's a secret visit, I'm sure I'm not the only one who was invited, right? The subordinate said, I went out to ask just now. Other than our residence, the first prince's residence and the prince's residence also received the imperial edict. The strange thing is that none of the officials attended the banquet. I heard from Hong Yang that the prince is here to discuss something important. It's said that it has something to do with Dayu State. Kim Yoon waved his hand and dismissed him, indicating that he knew what was going on. After the subordinate left, Gong Yimo leisurely walked out and raised her eyebrows. Eagle King Rucha? She rolled her eyes and seemed to be deep in thought. Kim Yoon said, Why? You even know Liu Ye's prince's background? Gong Yimo smiled. You think too highly of me. I don't know his background, but I know that he has some hobbies that few people know about. It's these hobbies that King Liu Yi doesn't like. When Kim Yoon heard this, he hurriedly poured her a cup of tea. Please enlighten me, princess. If it was any other time, Gong Yimo would have joked with him. However, she was a little hesitant now. She looked at him and didn't know if she should tell him. This King Rucha is 9 feet tall and as strong as a wild beast. He can eat more than 10 jin of meat in a meal and is extremely strong. He's a famous warrior of Liu Yi. However, his needs in that area are much more intense than ordinary people. Women often can't stand it, so? When she said this, Kim Yoon's face paled. His hands on the table couldn't help but clench into fists. So he caused the deaths of many people. That's why King Liu Yi doesn't like him and thinks that he's tarnishing the reputation of the imperial family. Impossible. I'm Imperial Father's biological son? Gong Yimo smiled. I didn't say that it must be like this. She frowned and continued, It's just that your Imperial Father obviously doesn't like you and is secretly meeting with King Liu Yi. However, he asked you to go. You should be more careful. Kim Yoon fell silent. The more he thought about it, the more ridiculous it was. Gong Yimo must be thinking too much. However, she did it out of kindness. So he nodded, indicating that he would be more careful. After understanding the situation, he prepared to enter the palace. However, he didn't want to bring Gong Yimo with him. After all, she was good-looking and would stand out more than other men in disguise. If King Liu Yi really took a fancy to her, what should he do? However, Gong Yimo waved her hand indifferently. Don't worry, I'm not going to follow you. I just want to go to the cold palace and find your imperial mother. To have a heart-to-heart talk. Chapter 177. Far in the south, Dayu State was also shrouded in dark clouds. The emperor hated Gong Dai for hiding the truth. After dealing with Nan of Gojoseon, he punished him with whipping and forbade him from receiving medical treatment. He had to kneel on the Temple of Heaven for 3 days and 3 nights. However, to everyone's disappointment, the emperor was so angry that he didn't take away the 50,000 imperial guards under his command. It could be seen that this punishment was all bark and no bite. In the cold weather, Gong Dai knelt on the snowy Temple of Heaven with his upper body bare. The crisscrossing whip marks on his body were shocking. However, he seemed to have lost consciousness and didn't move at all. He knelt until noon and his 3 days were up. At this time, his face was pale. There was no trace of the ruthlessness he had when he beheaded Nan of Gojoseon. The day after Gong Yimo escaped, Gong Dai brought a bramble to ask for punishment. At that time, the emperor dismissed everyone and spoke to him. Many people thought that the emperor had let him go. They didn't expect that he would only be punished after Nan of Gojoseon died. Many people thought that Gong Dai was lucky to run into Nan of Gojoseon's plot to murder the emperor. This caused the emperor to not care about him and let him off lightly. However, Gong Shi knew that the truth was far from that. When he walked far away, he gloomily glared at the figure in the snow. He couldn't accept it. He was so close. As long as Father Emperor used Nan of Gojoseon's things a few times, he would have succeeded. However, Gong Dai knew about such a little-known thing and even used it to make up for his crimes. Otherwise, based on his crime of harboring Gong Yimo, he wouldn't have been whipped. Moreover, Gong Dai seemed to have found something. The emperor's attitude towards him these days was much colder. The more Gong Shi thought about it, the more he hated him. His eyes were filled with a sinister light. Just you wait. Count yourself lucky this time. Next time, I'll make sure you're dead. Gong Dai wasn't idle either. He knelt there, but in his heart, he was silently chanting the mantra to expel the cold and heal the wound. Wind and nature was a very profound martial art. Every style and every move was very exquisite. Gong Dai was even somewhat glad that he practiced this kind of martial art. His heart was already ruthless. If it was any other slightly more extreme martial art, it might have caused his temperament to change greatly, becoming cold-blooded and unpredictable. It was snowing lightly in the sky. At this moment, someone came from afar with an umbrella, causing Gong Dai to open his eyes. Did she really leave? Gong Che didn't seem to believe it. He felt that Gong Yimo must still be hiding somewhere in the capital, waiting to play a prank on him. Gong Dai's mentality had already become strong and mature, so he was no longer on guard against Gong Che. He believed that with his strength, he could defeat all men. She's gone. Even I don't know where she went. Gong Dai lightly said. Just because she was mentioned, a trace of tenderness and helplessness appeared on the youth's face. His royal sister was really too powerful. He used all his manpower to search for her, but there was no news of her. It had only been a few days, so it was impossible for her to disappear without a trace. The only explanation was that she was no longer in the country. Gong Che's knuckles turned slightly white as he gripped the umbrella. He was dressed in a snow-white robe, but this whiteness was not as pale as his face. She's gone. These 2 words were so light that they dissipated in the wind. The corner of his mouth revealed a trace of a bitter smile. This smile was actually uglier than crying. He thought of the upcoming wedding. The palace was decorated with lanterns and decorations every day. And the only person he wanted to show it to, that person had left. It was as if his counterattack didn't get a response. His heart was empty. Moreover, in an instant, he also sighed for his own stupidity. Those who were involved could not see clearly. At that time, he only saw that Gong Yimo had rejected him. He only wanted to hear what she said, but did not consider how dangerous her situation was. Now that he thought back on his actions during this period of time, he only felt that it was laughable. She was no longer around. This marriage, was there still a need to go through? Gong Dai sneered. Why do you care? Anyway, you're about to get married. Ninth brother is here to congratulate you. Gong Dai's words caused Gong Che's figure to sway. His eyes flashed with a trace of ruthlessness for no reason. He couldn't get married. If he got married, then he would really have no chance. Thinking of this, he looked at Gong Dai's back. He also couldn't offend the Duke. Gong Dai was gradually rising. He couldn't lose to him. Seeing Gong Che leave in a hurry, Gong Dai didn't even turn his head back. He was thinking in his heart, thinking about what his next step should be. Only, he looked at the gray sky and smiled slightly. Royal sister, you must guard your heart well, because your heart can only be mine. Gong Yimo sneezed slightly. Looking at the anxious Madame Yunjin in front of her, she leisurely ate her snacks. The palace banquet hasn't started yet. Why are you in such a hurry? She swayed back and forth, making her dizzy. Hearing this, Yunjin looked at her timidly. Now, she already knew that Gong Yimo was a woman, but she was still very afraid of her. So when she saw her lying on her bed and eating without changing her clothes, she didn't dare to say a word. I'm just afraid that Yun will be taken advantage of. After all, when the emperor forced her that day, he said such threatening words. But how could she say such words? Gong Yimo comforted her. Don't worry. Chapter 178. Unfortunately, the emperor didn't even look at her. She was just a palace maid. If he wanted to play with her, so be it. This Liu Ye's Eagle King was as strong as a ferocious beast, just like the rumors said. Moreover, he had a big beard and eyes as big as copper bells. He looked very frightening. At this moment, his hands were extremely disobedient as they touched the woman in his arms. He used too much strength, causing the little palace maid to turn pale from the pain. She cried out softly. However, Rucha didn't care. He stared at Kim Yun and chuckled. There are so many beauties here. Why don't your highness enjoy one? As he spoke, he stared at Kim Yun's lower body with lustful eyes. His smile became even more vulgar. Jin Sheng saw this and snorted coldly. He was indeed the son of a slut. He knew how to seduce people. It was such a waste that he was born a man. Fortunately, there was a buyer who didn't abstain from meat and vegetables. Perhaps he could be sold for a good price. He ordered calmly, Yun, leave first. Go and see how the preparations for the banquet are going. Tonight, we won't leave until we're drunk. Kim Yun couldn't stay any longer. He quickly got up and left. As soon as he left, Rucha pulled a long face and pushed away the woman in his arms. His voice was as loud as a bell. What does your highness mean by this? Jin Sheng lay down and smiled coldly. She can't run away. Let's talk business first. Is the news you said earlier true? Although Rucha was a little dissatisfied, he was still in someone else's territory. His heart was itching, so he endured it. Do you think I would lie to you? The princess of Daiyu State has a sharp weapon that can split open mountains and split open the earth. Didn't you see how anxious the emperor of Daiyu State was? He almost forced her to death. However, there's reliable news that she's still alive. Now, whoever gets her first will have the right to rule the world. Jin Sheng didn't believe it. She was just a woman. What ability could she have? In his opinion, most women were smart and docile like the empress, or fragile and beautiful like Yunjin. They weren't the popular Chaoyang princess. He felt that the princess must be extremely ugly. Otherwise, why would no one praise her appearance when she appeared in public? Gong Yimo. She touched her ears and continued to persuade her you? Gong Yimo winked and smiled. How can there be no way? Let me tell you too. First, you can coax the emperor, assassinate him, and help your son become the emperor. You can be the empress dowager. Then, you'll be the most powerful woman in Yuheng. You can go wherever you want and do whatever you want. She glanced at Yunjin, whose eyes had widened in fear at her words. Yunjin pursed her lips. Forget it. Second, you can coax the emperor. Once you have power and influence, and your son has power and influence, you can fake your death and leave the palace. The words, leave the palace, made Yunjin's eyes light up. However, when she thought of the prerequisites, she couldn't help but feel discouraged. No, I can't be his opponent. He's so fierce and cruel. She looked very wronged when she said this. In short, she didn't want to do it. You can try. What are you afraid of with me around? Yunjin glanced at her. She sat there like a little daughter-in-law and didn't say anything. Gong Yimo was a little impatient. She sat up and asked very seriously. Can I ask why you're so against the emperor? Did he beat you until you're scared? How about this? As long as you listen to me, I promise he won't beat you in the future. When Yoon-jin heard this, she said shyly after a while, I think he's ugly. What? Gong Yimo thought she heard wrong and asked subconsciously, I said he's ugly. Her voice was louder this time, which made Gong Yimo's eyes widen. Oh my, is this still a young girl? She didn't say it. In ancient times, there were only a few emperors who were as handsome as Emperor Gongcheng. Most of them didn't have good looks, especially those who liked to grow beards. In Gong Yimo's opinion, Jianshang wasn't good-looking, but he was barely acceptable. She actually used such a reason to refuse to be favored. Gong Yimo was speechless. This was the first time she felt so stifled that she couldn't speak. Didn't those favored concubines in history admit that they were ugly when they met them? They didn't say anything when they married someone in their 60s or 70s. She actually had the nerve. If she didn't have the ability to change the situation, she should accept it, okay? If she didn't have the ability, how could she be so picky? Gong Yimo took a few bites of snacks to calm herself down. She needed to calm down. It was getting late. Gong Yimo looked at the time and thought the banquet should be over. Why hadn't Kim Yoon come back yet? Was she right? Yoon-jin kept waiting at the door, looking in from time to time for fear that she would miss something. After waiting for a long time, she couldn't help but ask Gong Yimo for help. Miss Shiryu, Yoon hasn't come back for so long. I'm worried. Can you help me find him? Shiryu was Gong Yimo's alias. She rolled her eyes. If I'm not here, who are you going to ask for help from? Yoon-jin choked, then gritted her teeth and was about to kneel in front of her. Miss Shiryu. She knelt on the ground and begged. I know you're angry that I'm weak, but Yoon is innocent. His Majesty is biased against him. And His Majesty said, what else did he say? Yoon-jin couldn't bring herself to say it. Anyway, Miss Shiryu, please do him a favor and help him. Gong Yimo looked at the sky and said slowly, get up. Wait a moment. I'll go. Yoon-jin wanted to urge her, but she was asking for help. Besides, Gong Yimo scared her, so she didn't dare to ask. This disappointed Gong Yimo. When Kim Yoon woke up, he found himself on a luxurious bed. When he got up, he felt weak all over. Then, he found that he was naked. His expression changed from anger to disappointment to pain, and finally to panic. He thought of the wine that his father personally toasted him at the banquet. He was flattered, but he didn't expect it to be like this. He wanted to leave this place. He wanted to ask why. What was the reason? With this thought, he immediately sat up. This seemed to be Xingyun Palace, which was used to entertain important guests. It was also the most exquisite place in the entire palace. His father was really considerate. He wanted to laugh, but the bitterness and anger in his expression were so heartbreaking. From the way he treated his mother, it could be seen that Kim Yoon was a very sentimental person. He always had a glimmer of hope for his father. But Jin Shang's action really chilled his heart. His chest hurt, and his whole body trembled. Jin Yun's taut muscles, flushed face, and lips that were about to bleed from biting too hard. All of these made his blood boil. He loved to rape and subdue disobedient people the most. Jin Shang really gave him a big stunner. What a pity! He could only enjoy this stunner once before killing him. What a pity! Rucha thought as he slowly took off his clothes. Kim Yoon struggled to crawl to a corner and stared at Rucha with hatred. No, even if he died, he would never submit to a man. When Rucha pressed down on him, Kim Yoon closed his eyes and wanted to bite his tongue to commit suicide. But he neglected one point. The tongue was very tough. With his current strength, he couldn't bite it off. He raised his head to look at the top of the bed and felt that he was really being pressed down by a disgusting man. That pair of beautiful eyes finally showed despair. He suddenly hated that he was born with such a face, hated that he was born in such a place. Why? He had always had hope in his heart and had always worked hard to live. Why did he have to suffer like this? Why? He was disgusted by this world. Suddenly, Rucha groaned and fell to the ground. Kim Yoon raised his head in surprise and saw Gong Yimo miraculously appear in front of him. She seemed a little embarrassed as she grinned. I'm not too late, am I? She had some injuries on her body, but at this moment, she, who was in a sorry state, was like a ray of light that shone in when he was being invaded by darkness. At the critical moment, She dispelled the darkness and saved his heart. In fact, many evil people would not become like this if someone was willing to help them when they were being twisted. And Gong Yimo was the one who helped Kim Yoon. Kim Yoon closed his eyes and laid on the bed. Although he didn't even have the strength to push Rucher away, he still revealed a smile. He was saved. Gong Yimo sat on the side of the bed, gasping for breath. She also didn't have any strength. Historically, all the guards who entered the imperial palace had to retreat to the periphery, but this Liu Yezhuangya had openly brought them in. Just now, she wanted to kill her way in without batting an eyelid, but it really took a lot of effort. Kim Yoon finally had some strength after lying down for a while. The first thing he did was to push the person on top of him away. Then he raised the jade pillow and prepared to smash him to death. The enmity of humiliation was irreconcilable. Only his blood could wash away the sin. But Gong Yimo stopped him. Wait a minute, I still have use for this person. Who knew that Kim Yoon, who was always easy to talk to, would angrily stare at her. This person, I can't tolerate him for even a second. I want him to die. Die immediately. Gong Yimo's hand tightly held onto his hand, not moving an inch. Her eyes were cold and firm. Is there any use? If you kill him, have you considered the consequences? Even if you have some connections to escape, what about your imperial mother? I'll say this first. I don't have the ability to bring a woman out of the palace with 10,000 imperial guards. But you're just going to let it go like this? Kim Yoon seemed to be asking her in a disbelieving tone, but his eyes were red and his chest was heaving up and down. The hand holding the jade pillow was so tight that it was trembling. It was clear that his heart was filled with anger. He almost humiliated me. A warrior can be killed, but not humiliated. Even if I kill him 100 times, it won't be too much. Isn't it too much? If you want to sacrifice your life and your imperial mother's life for a scum, then go ahead. After saying that, Gong Yimo really let go of his hand in a fit of anger. But her last sentence was heard by Kim Yoon. But the great humiliation made him raise his hand and put it down again. The fierce light in his eyes did not fade. Gong Yimo said indifferently, "You obviously can't bear the consequences, but you still want to act in a moment of anger. Do you think that this kind of person is a hot-blooded man?" Gong Yimo sighed and touched her shoulder that was still bleeding, grimacing. Living in adversity is a very difficult thing. Since you've been enduring, why don't you continue to endure? Clench your teeth and endure? If you don't endure and fight for the final fruit, then what's the point of enduring in the past? Seeing Kim Yoon biting his lips tightly, Gong Yimo couldn't help but soften her tone and said word by word, "You have to remember clearly that you didn't come to this world to suffer, but to break the suffering and obtain happiness. You may have been in pain, but as long as the heavens don't play you to death, you still have a chance. Isn't that right?" Chapter 180. Her words caused Kim Yoon's hurried breathing to gradually calm down. His eyes also gradually calmed down. That's right, if he couldn't succeed, then what was the point of all this? What was the point of all his hard work and sacrifice? He put down the jade pillow and asked in an extremely cold voice, "Then what do you want to do with him?" Gong Yimo breathed a sigh of relief, revealing an expression of a child who could be taught. Just now, did he say anything to you? Time was of the essence, so Gong Yimo went straight to the point. Kim Yoon faintly sighed. Then he gritted his teeth and said, "He said that I had been exchanged for 1,000 horses by that person. Right now, he wasn't even willing to call him imperial father. He only felt disgust towards that person." And his words made Gong Yimo ponder deeply. She coldly looked at the big man in disheveled clothes in front of her, revealing a trace of cold light. Everyone knew that Rucha was disliked by King Liu Yi because of some of his hobbies. However, this person had some ability and was very loyal, so King Liu Yi trusted him a lot. He only pretended to dislike him on the surface to confuse the public. Gong Yimo reached out and pulled the life tablet from his neck. This thing was worn by all the people with status in Liu Yi. Not only did it symbolize their status, it could also be used to order their subordinates. Therefore, it was also called a command tablet. Seeing the tablet was like seeing the person. She looked at the small words on the tablet and said to Kim Yoon, "Just now, I killed 4 people guarding outside. Moreover, They also revealed that Rucha had many people protecting him. They would take turns to change shifts. In a while, the people changing shifts might come. When they come and see the person on duty, they will definitely come over to ask. At that time, you will appear and use this command tablet to order them to do something. What is it? Kim Yoon didn't ask such a stupid question. He believed in Gong Yimo. Everything she did was reasonable. Gong Yimo smiled. Don't blame me. You're the one that their prince has taken a fancy to. He can't go first, so you're the only one who can. As for what message to pass, tell them to look for the Emperor of Yuheng and tell him that the horse deal is invalid. Remember, you can only tell Jin Shang. If he can't figure it out, he will definitely be furious and come looking for trouble with Prince Lu Yi. At that time, we will be able to catch the tail of the horse. Kim Yoon nodded and accepted the token. At this moment, he felt a little cold in hindsight. Because of his emotions, he didn't notice it. Winter in Yuheng was even colder than in Dayu State. They didn't have an earth dragon here, so it would be strange if he didn't feel cold when he was naked. However, Gong Yimo didn't seem to notice that he wasn't wearing any clothes. She pricked up her ears and waited for the guards to change shifts. At the same time, she sized up the man lying on the bed with a sneaky look in her eyes. 1,000 horses, this wasn't a small number. One must know that in ancient times, millions of soldiers were bragged a lot. There wasn't a real number at all. Moreover, Lu Yi had a lot of precious horses, but he was very strict about it. Therefore, this kind of deal couldn't go through Prince Lu Yi. She didn't know what tricks Prince Lu Yi wanted to play this time. Thinking of that domineering and ambitious man, Gong Yimo shook her head. However, she saw Kim Yoon looking at her blankly, as if he didn't know what to say. What's wrong? Kim Yoon tugged at the blanket. He didn't understand why a 20-year-old man like him, who often mingled in brothels, would feel so uncomfortable in front of a young girl. The moment her eyes fell on him, he felt as if he was scalded. I don't have any clothes here. How will I go out later? Gong Yimo said as if it was a matter of course. Only with clothes will people be suspicious, okay? Later, you will wear this when you go out. As she said this, she pulled out the silk blanket from the bed and threw it on him. But looking at it, she felt that it was a bit inappropriate. When he went out later, Rucha's subordinates would see that there wasn't a single trace on him. It really didn't look like he had been pampered by Prince Rucha. This prince was very cruel. How would he know how to have tender feelings for the fairer sex? She took out a box of matte eyeshadow and some disguise tools from her space. Seeing her approaching with something, Kim Yoon hugged the silk blanket and leaned back. What are you doing? His beautiful eyes opened wide. Although he was 20 years old, because he had been practicing dance since he was young, he looked like a 16-year-old youth. His body was in the best period of being half soft and half hard, so tender that it was like water. Gong Yimo smiled. Naturally, I'm going to put on makeup for you. You don't want me to personally make a few bloody marks on your body, right? As she said this, she pounced on him and used a small brush to carefully draw on his body. Her eyes didn't have the slightest bit of desire, only clarity. This made Kim Yoon feel relieved, but also a little disappointed. His face was unforgettable for anyone who saw it, no matter if it was a man or a woman. But Gong Yimo didn't have any feelings at all. Kim Yoon thought that it was probably because she was still young and didn't understand it. At this time, Gong Yimo was immersed in drawing on his chest. That serious look was like she was treating a piece of art. Fortunately, she had a lot of tools in her hands, so she wasn't afraid of anything. But her actions made Kim Yoon suffer. That small brush was like a feather, gently teasing his body. Unfortunately, he was someone who was very ticklish. But seeing how serious Gong Yimo was, he didn't dare to move and could only bear with it. But Gong Yimo accidentally touched his sensitive spot. He couldn't help but let out a soft groan and gasped. This soft groan seemed to have ignited something. It made the two of them stop and stare at each other. Kim Yoon only felt his face burning. The one who groaned just now wasn't him. Not him. Not him. Gong Yimo slowly opened her mouth after a while. If you want to scream, go ahead. As she said this, she took the small brush and continued to apply. She said in a serious tone, after all, when this guy is pampering someone, it's definitely not quiet. As she said this, She even nodded seriously. Go ahead and scream. Someone will be here soon. It's not good to be so quiet. How could he possibly scream? Kim Yoon wanted to find a hole to hide in. It was just an act. There was no need to go through so much. But Gong Yimo insisted. No, you must scream. Scream more intensely. Kim Yoon only felt that his mouth was glued to everything. If he didn't scream, he couldn't even make a sound. But reality gave him a cruel slap. Gong Yimo saw that he didn't say anything and pinched his chest hard. This stimulation came fiercely and fiercely, causing Kim Yoon to scream. His voice was pleasant to the ear, and this scream made Gong Yimo tremble all over. This was probably the legendary kind of scream that made one's soul leave their body, right? She touched her nose and continued to paint. Kim Yoon's face was originally red, and now even his body was red. But seeing how calm Gong Yimo was, he was a little unconvinced. Wasn't it just a few screams? He had heard many of them in the brothel. Could it be that he wasn't afraid of a little girl? As he thought about this, he didn't care about his bottom line anymore and started to scream in a low voice. The red tint seemed to heat up in an instant. Under Kim Yoon's sometimes loud and sometimes low moans, Gong Yimo almost couldn't hold the small brush in her hand. She wiped her sweat. At this moment, Kim Yoon was lying on the bed. His upper body had turned a light pink. His exquisite face, paired with his black hair, had an indescribable purity and seductiveness. She was indeed the world's #1 beauty. When her beauty reached a certain level, it didn't differentiate between gender. Gong Yimo drew one ambiguous mark after another on his body. Under the light, it seemed like it was real, and she was the one doing it. The temperature in the bed rose again. She really wanted to kill him. Chapter 181. After a while, her ears twitched and she hurriedly put everything away. She gave Kim Yoon a look. Someone is here. That person hesitated at the door for a moment before asking, Is His Highness well? At this moment, the door opened and Kim Yoon's expressionless face was indeed there. He was wearing a thin layer of silk and there were traces on his body that couldn't be covered. His eyes were empty, as if he had already resigned himself to his fate. His Highness is asleep and wants me to give this to you. He wants you to do something. That person was stunned and took the token, asking, Where is the person who was on duty? Kim Yoon sneered. I've sent him out. Why does His Highness need your permission to do anything? Seeing that person's hesitation, Kim Yoon impatiently turned to the side. If you don't believe me, you can go and ask him yourself. As he spoke, he tiredly retreated to the side and leaned against the door frame. This subordinate doesn't dare. When that person heard him say this, he believed most of it, and his attitude became more honest. What does His Highness want this subordinate to do? Kim Yoon didn't even look at him as he said faintly, It's nothing much. He just wants you to find my good imperial father and tell him that the horse deal is invalid. This? That person's coarse face showed some hesitation. He thought to himself, this was clearly something that had been discussed. Why did he change his mind just like that? Thinking about it, he glanced at Kim Yoon. Perhaps His Highness's new favorite said something. So His Highness flew into a rage for a woman? Kim Yoon looked at him coldly. Is there a problem? No, this subordinate will do it right away. Remember, this matter can only be told to my imperial father. Yes, Golden Hall Palace. When Jin Shang was dug out of his tinder home, he was very dissatisfied. But when he heard that it was Ruch's people, he still received them. But when he heard what they said, he immediately flew into a rage. What is the meaning of your highness? We have already agreed on the terms. Why did he change his mind just like that? For the sake of a pleasant cooperation, he had even sent his own son to his bed. Did he want to go back on his word after eating it? After saying that, he couldn't be bothered to argue with a servant, and angrily went to Cloud Palace. At this time, Kim Yoon had already put on his clothes. Gong Yimo pulled down the curtains so that outsiders could not see the situation inside. At least when Jin Shang came in, he only saw the two figures behind the curtain. He came in alone and said angrily, What do you mean? Unexpectedly, the one who answered him was actually Kim Yoon. He walked out of the curtain step by step and looked at Jin Shang. His eyes were blazing with fire. He smiled coldly. Imperial father. It's just the literal meaning. Rucha thinks that it's too much of a loss to trade with horses, so he wants to exchange some chips with you. Kim Yoon's appearance made Jin Sheng retreat with a guilty conscience. Moreover, Kim Yoon's current appearance was really frightening. His eyes were filled with anger and hatred. It was as if he was an evil spirit that had crawled out from hell. He was here to take his life. Seeing the ambiguous marks on his bare chest, Jin Sheng quickly turned his head away, not daring to look. He only said to the person on the bed, "Exchange chips? Impossible. It can only be horses, and it has to be war horses. Otherwise, there's nothing to talk about." Kim Yoon sneered. "So Imperial Father really exchanged me for horses? You really have no shame." His words were like a slap to Jin Sheng's face. Impudent. He flew into a rage and said viciously, "What do you know? It's your honor to be able to contribute to the country. Isn't it just sleeping with a man? So what? You're a bastard." Jin Sheng's words deeply hurt Kim Yoon. It was as if a knife had sliced his chest into pieces. At this moment, he heard Rucha's voice from the bed's curtains. "Yoon, don't be rude." This voice gave Kim Yoon a fright. He stood there for a long time, unable to regain his senses. This is Gong Yimo's voice? From the curtains, Gong Yimo continued, "As for your Majesty Yu Hung, this exchange, no matter how this prince thinks about it, this prince feels that this is a loss. War horses are hard to come by. Since you're here, why don't we continue to discuss the issue of quantity?" Pay. Her words made Jin Sheng so angry that his face turned green. He thought that he was already very shameless, but he didn't expect the other party to be even more shameless. She raised the price on the spot, causing him to lose a peerless son for nothing. So in his extreme anger, he couldn't care about anything else and directly said, "Do you think we're afraid of you? If you want to go back on your words, sure, we'll just break up. It's just 10,000 horses, we don't want it." Kim Yoon was shocked. "Isn't it 1,000 horses?" When Jin Sheng heard this, he looked at him sympathetically. "Silly son, 1,000 horses is just a down payment. Without 10,000 horses, you want to borrow Yu Heng's road to attack Dayu State? Dream on. We're still thinking that it's too little, and you still want to bargain?" His words silenced the room. After a while, Gong Yimo said, "Yoon, get out." At this time, Jin Yoon was extremely shocked. He actually obediently walked out. At this moment, Jin Sheng finally realized that something was wrong. He rushed to the bed and pulled open the curtains, but all he saw was darkness and he lost consciousness. Kim Yoon had just walked to the door when he saw him collapse. He couldn't regain his senses for a long time. Make way for Lu Yi. Was Jin Sheng crazy? How dare he agree to such a deal? If he went back on his words at the last minute, it would be tantamount to inviting a wolf into the house, and the entire Yu Heng state would suffer. While he was still in shock, Gong Yimo was dragging Jin Sheng onto the bed. He couldn't help but ask in a daze, "Aren't you worried? Lu Yi wants to attack Dayu State." Gong Yimo reached out to take off Jin Sheng's clothes. Fortunately, Jin Sheng came in alone, or else they would have alerted the enemy. When she heard Kim Yoon's words, she rolled her eyes. King Lu Yi has been wanting to invade the Central Plains for a long time. What's there to be surprised about? Her words made Kim Yoon speechless, and his hands clenched into fists. When he thought about how Yu Heng would be caught in the flames of war because of Jin Sheng's mistake, he gritted his teeth and said, "This can't be done. If it succeeds, Yu Heng will be in danger." Gong Yimo smiled. "Jin Sheng isn't that stupid. Don't you still have 10,000 horses? This is a considerable fighting force. If Lu Yi really wants to go back on his words during the passage, with the advantage of location and these war horses, Yu Heng will be able to resist for a while. Moreover, he can ask Dayu State for help the moment Lu Yi goes back on his words. If the lips are gone, the teeth will be cold. Dayu State will definitely help, so he's not stupid. This deal isn't a loss." If Lu Yi successfully ambushed Dayu State, and Dayu State was caught off guard, Yu Heng would definitely switch sides with Lu Yi. When the time came, two countries would fight against one country. If they succeeded, they would reap even more benefits. Such a clever idea didn't seem like something Jin Sheng could come up with. Kim Yoon also laughed coldly. "Asking a tiger for its skin? Why don't you see if he has the brains and appetite to do so?" After he finished speaking, he realized that Gong Yimo was stripping the emperor of his clothes. He quickly walked over. "What are you doing?" Gong Yimo smiled mischievously. "You're right. I don't believe that this is Jin Shang's idea either. Moreover, didn't you say that you don't want this to succeed? So, I'm sabotaging it." A faint light flashed in her eyes. "This is really fun. I wonder if the two people behind Yuheng's emperor being raped by Liu Ye's prince will still be able to sit still." Because it was a little disgusting, Gong Yimo simply sealed her five senses and closed her eyes to rest. But she didn't expect that something would happen at this late hour. Because the palace doors were locked and Kim Yoon was feeling muddle-headed, he went to the cold palace. He originally wanted to report to his mother that he was safe and sound, but he didn't expect to hear a woman's scream coming from the cold palace. This voice was, "Mother?" Kim Yoon was shocked. He angrily ran in, only to see his mother being pressed down on the bed by two men. That scene made his blood flow backward. Without thinking, he rushed up to tear them apart. Yoon Jin dodged a bullet and quickly hugged her clothes to the foot of the bed. Kim Yoon wanted to hit again, but the other party's guards reacted and grabbed his hands and feet. His entire face was flushed with anger as he stared at the two people in front of him, wishing he could tear off a piece of flesh. "Jinzhou, are you crazy? Are you crazy?" He screamed at the top of his lungs. That's right, the two people who came to the cold palace in the middle of the night. One was the eldest prince, Jinzhou, and the other was the fourth prince, Jin Ming. At this time, they were calmly staring at Kim Yoon, not putting him in their eyes at all. "Oh, who was I? So it's the second prince who was taken by a man. Bah, I almost forgot. How can such a slut be worthy of a prince? He's just like his slut mother, used to seducing people." As he spoke, Jin Zhou glanced at Yun Jin on the bed. At this time, she seemed to be scared silly. She was motionless and hugging herself tightly, unable to hear anything. Her appearance also frightened Kim Yoon. He shouted loudly for his mother, but she was still unmoved, as if she had lost her soul. Why was it like this? What was going on? At night, he was drugged by his own father and sent to a man's bed. Late at night, his beastly brothers actually wanted to lay their hands on his mother. The imperial family's corruption was so disgusting. What hope did he have? What hope did he have? At this time, Jinming also came up and shamelessly asked, "How is it, second brother? Is the taste of this man good?" As he spoke, he laughed loudly, as if he was extremely happy to see Kim Yoon in so much pain that he wished he was dead. "I'm going to kill you all," Kim Yoon said in a low voice. "What?" Jinming didn't hear clearly and came over to listen with a smile, but Kim Yoon bit his ear tightly. "Ah!" He screamed and repeatedly called for people to pull him away, but when the guards who pulled Kim Yoon dragged Kim Yoon back, Jinming screamed even more miserably. Jin Zhou's eyes flashed fiercely as he punched and kicked Kim Yoon. "Let go, bastard! Let go of me!" The sound of flesh being hit and Jin Ming's screams made people's scalp tingle, but Kim Yoon didn't seem to feel the pain. He stared at Jin Zhou and bit his ear tightly, as if he wanted to bite it off. Jin Zhou's eyes flashed fiercely. A prince who had already been sent out by his father to warn the bed dares to rebel? He took out a dagger and stabbed towards Kim Yoon's face. Suddenly, Yun Jin woke up from her dream. She, who had always been cowardly and only knew how to endure, screamed and rushed over. "You are not allowed to hurt my son." As she spoke, she ruthlessly smashed the jade pillow on Jin Zhou's head, causing blood to flow out. At this time, Kim Yoon finally let go of Jin Ming's ear. He covered his ear and sat on the ground screaming again and again. It was actually bitten in half by Kim Yoon. Kim Yoon cracked open his bloody teeth and laughed. "Crazy. All of you are crazy." In any case, this world was dirty and disgusting. A sober person would not be able to survive. The scene was in chaos. Yun Jin rushed over and wiped the blood on her son's face. The tears in her eyes were like a broken dam. Yun. Hateful. Jin Zhou looked at his brother on the ground and fiercely pushed Yun Jin away. He grabbed Kim Yoon's collar. He was shorter than Kim Yoon, So he looked up at Kim Yoon, whose hands and feet were caught, and grinned. You dare to rebel in my hands? My good brother, you really don't understand your brother's means. As he spoke, he let go of him and picked up the cloud brocade on the ground. He held the dagger on Yoon Jin's neck with one hand and pinched her chin with the other to prevent her from biting her tongue to commit suicide. Then, he called the guards to release Kim Yoon. Look carefully. You see how I disfigure this slut's face. Chapter 183. Yoon Jin looked at Kim Yoon with tears in her eyes. The meaning in her eyes was that she hoped her son would not care about her. Isn't it just a face? This face has already brought her too much trouble. Kim Yoon looked at his mother and then looked at Jin Zhou. His eyes seemed to bleed. He smiled bitterly. Just say it. What do you want me to do for you to let my mother go? At this time, there was still blood in his mouth. His voice was very calm, but his heart was filled with grief and indignation. His eyes were sometimes crazy and sometimes desperate. His whole person was in the middle of these two emotional storms. He was being pulled, but no matter which side it was a hell of eternal damnation. Seeing Kim Yoon being so obedient, Jin Zhou laughed proudly. You're crazy. Bite me. I'll let you be like a dog. Kneel down. Kim Yoon obeyed and knelt down. At this time, even if he was in a sorry state, it did not affect his beauty. Jin Zhou was very jealous because he looked very mediocre. Therefore, he grinned and threw the dagger in his hand at Kim Yoon's feet. Cheap bastard, pick it up for me. Kim Yoon's eyes flashed with a bloodthirsty light. His chest felt like it was going to split open. He wanted to explode. But when he saw his mother, who was alone and helpless, he finally bowed his head and picked up the dagger, holding it tightly in his hand. Jin Zhou greedily looked at his face, but more than that, he had an impulse to tear and destroy. He slowly smiled. Now, I want you to scratch your own face. How about this? If you scratch it hard enough, deep enough, I'll let your mother go. Otherwise, he looked at Yoon Jin's tear-stained face with lust. Ignoring her resentful eyes, he sneered. Otherwise, I've been thirsty for Yoon Jin's wife for a long time. It's so late. I'm afraid no one will stop me. Kim Yoon suddenly looked up at him. His eyes were deep and cold, as if he came from the abyss of purgatory. He wanted to desperately stab the dagger into the other's heart and tear everything in front of him apart. But he couldn't. He had to endure again. He was once again forced to the edge of the cliff by despair, with nowhere to retreat. In these few short hours, he had been drugged, almost humiliated, and his mother had almost been violated. Now, he had to kneel on the ground and wag his tail to beg for mercy. He sneered. Was there really any hope left in this world? Why was it that no matter how hard he tried, he could only be trampled on? Why was it that when he was full of hope, all that came was despair? He raised his hand and looked at the dagger's sharpness. The coldness of the dagger seemed to come from the depths of hell. Perhaps humans were born into this world to suffer. However, God gave you something called hope in order to let you struggle on your deathbed, everything. It was just a dream. Stab. Jin Zhou suddenly roared. Kim Yoon's eyes were filled with despair. If it wasn't for his face, he wouldn't have been fancied by a man. It doesn't matter if it's scratched or gone. The dagger stabbed down forcefully. He used a lot of strength. He hoped that Jin Zhou would let go of his mother for the sake of his obedience. But at the same time, the window cracked open and a figure rushed in. Because of the urgency of the situation, she only had time to hold the dagger's edge. Who is it? Ignoring Jin Zhou's panic, Gong Yimou looked at Kim Yoon's wide-open eyes. She was greatly relieved. Fortunately, this time, I made it. Who are you? Jin Zhou retreated and shouted, Someone come. Are you all dead? Quickly catch her. The dagger was tightly embedded in Gong Yimou's palm, but Kim Yoon's breathing became cautious. He hurriedly loosened his grip, but his hand was still stained with blood. The successive shocks had left him completely dumbfounded. He opened his mouth, but he couldn't say a single word. Gong Yimou threw away the dagger. That bloody palm made his heart ache. He subconsciously held her hand, and then gently, he hugged it tightly in his arms. The guards approached. Gong Yimo only raised her head, but those people seemed to be frightened and hesitated. Taking advantage of this, Gong Yimo smiled at Jin Zhou. Your Highness, you are still here. Do you know that something big happened to His Majesty? As expected, Jin Zhou was taken away by her words. What? He wanted to see what she had to say. It wouldn't be too late to take her down. Gong Yimo sighed. Just now when I came over from Xingyun Palace, I heard Eagle King Lu Ye's roar and His Majesty's screams. Then, His Majesty suddenly went silent. I'm afraid. Before she could finish, Jin Zhou hurriedly walked out. He wasn't thinking about saving his father, but if his father died, he could inherit the throne. It was this idiot who abandoned his injured younger brother and took away all his guards. Regardless of whether Jin Ming was still on the other side of the bed, he was crying out in a low and pitiful voice. At this time, his face was pale. Jin Zhou's first reaction was not to call a doctor for him, but to vent his anger on Jin Yun. Thinking about it, it wasn't a glorious thing for them to be in the cold palace. Gong Yimo said to the remaining guards of Jin Ming, "Why are you still standing there? He is in so much pain that he is delirious. If something happens to him, are you waiting to lose your heads?" The guards woke up from their daze. As for finding trouble with Kim Yun or taking down Gong Yimo, sorry, they didn't think about it at all. Didn't they see that she solved the deadlock with just a few words? Not only did she save the second prince, she didn't even make a move. Moreover, her aura was shocking. One look and they could tell that she was a powerful person. Just a few small fries like them should forget about it. Gong Yimo sighed. At this moment, Yun Jin woke up from her daze and rushed over with a scream. She trembled as she touched her son's face and said with tears in her eyes, "Are you okay? Mother is useless. Mother is sorry." If it was any other time, Kim Yun would definitely comfort her. But now, he was kneeling on the ground and holding Gong Yimo's hand, causing Gong Yimo to squat and talk. She hissed and glared at Kim Yun, who seemed to have lost his soul. She said angrily, "If you don't let go, my hand will be crippled. If it leaves a scar, I won't be able to get married." As soon as she spoke, Kim Yun raised his head and looked at her deeply. His face was still stained with blood, but his eyes were bright. His mouth moved, wanting to say, "If you can't get married, I will marry you." But thinking about it, he was a useless person. What right did he have to say such words to her now? She had saved him many times. He sighed and let go of Gong Yimo's hand. Seeing her take out a bottle of medicine, he quickly took it and helped her wipe it. He cleaned the wound so gently, as if he was holding a rare treasure. Throughout the whole process, he was kneeling. Chapter 184. Yun Jin stopped crying and hurriedly went to fetch some water to help. Only the two of them were left in the room, along with the mess on the floor. Seeing him like this, Gong Yimo knew that he had suffered quite a blow. However, she wasn't good at comforting people, so she pretended to exaggerate. "You don't know. I was doing fine at Xingyun Palace, but I kept feeling uneasy. I suddenly remembered that you wouldn't be able to leave the palace so late at night, so you must be here. As expected, luckily I made it in time." She glanced at Kim Yun, who didn't react at all and was only busy applying medicine. She paused, then grinned and said, "It's all thanks to my brilliant sixth sense. Otherwise, if your face was ruined, it would be a loss to the 4 countries." Kim Yun finally looked up at her and asked softly, "Doesn't it hurt?" Gong Yimo was stunned by his question. Kim Yun lowered his eyes again to look at the shocking wound on her palm, his voice even softer. "Doesn't it hurt here?" Hearing that, Gong Yimo suddenly felt a little embarrassed. "Of course it hurts. How can it not hurt?" Kim Yun laughed. "Since it hurts, why are you comforting me instead?" Gong Yimo answered without thinking. "You were wronged outside, and when you came back, your mother cried when she heard it. Aren't you comforting her instead?" Gong Yimo didn't think too much about it, but Kim Yun's heart was in turmoil. It was different from the anger from before. This time, it was a different kind of emotion. His eyelashes couldn't help but flutter as he lowered his eyes and said in a seemingly unconcerned tone, "If you feel pain in the future, you can tell me too." Gong Yimo smiled. She was too lazy to squat, so she sat back on the ground. Her hand was carefully taken care of, and her legs even shook in satisfaction. It's fine. It's just a small injury. She didn't care at all. Minor injuries? Kim Yoon didn't dare to agree. His mother would feel wronged for a long time when her fingers were pricked by needles. She thought that it was a bad sign and felt sad. However, she had 2 big wounds on her hand and said that it was a small injury. It was so deep. It could be seen how anxious she was at that time and how tightly she held on to it. For the first time in his life, Jin Yoon felt the feeling of being protected. This is indeed a small injury, Gong Yimo said in a light tone. In her previous life, she had suffered too many injuries, so she was actually very afraid of getting hurt and pain. However, when she was really injured, she was not afraid anymore. Only when Gong Dai was around would she pretentiously snort a few times. Seeing that Kim Yoon didn't answer and looked a little sad, she couldn't help but use her good hand to touch his hair. The number 1 beauty under the heavens. Even his hair was beautiful. It was silky and smooth to the touch, and his gentle appearance made one's heart ache. You don't have to deny yourself and life for these scum. You're much better than them. Kim Yoon's hand that was applying medicine paused. You think that I'm better than them? He smiled bitterly. Perhaps only you would think so. He had no power, no strength. He only had a face. He was a complete weakling. However, Gong Yimo shook her head. You underestimate yourself too much. When you're in adversity, you don't give up hope. When everyone is ostracizing you, you can still use your clever mind to find a way to make money and improve your life. Moreover, you will do your best to help a group of truly weak people. Gong Yimo shook her head and smiled. A person who has the ability to help others, who works hard in adversity, who doesn't give up hope, who is filial and grateful, definitely can't be weak. Kim Yoon couldn't help but look into her eyes. A person's eyes would never lie. However, he only saw the smile in her eyes and absolute sincerity. She wanted to tell him that hope wasn't a lie from God, but something worth believing in. Therefore, she said, you're a sincere and kind person. In my opinion, you're better than everyone in Yuhang. Kim Yoon couldn't help but smile. This smile drove away all the haze, and it was so beautiful that it could shine under the light. His eyes sparkled and were filled with hope again. His smile was so beautiful that Gong Yimo couldn't help but stare at him in a daze. Actually, the reason why I thought of becoming a singer was because of you. Gong Yimo pointed at her own nose in hindsight. Because of me? Yes. He lowered his head, leaving an extremely beautiful arc. Although I thought of many ways to earn money back then, I couldn't make ends meet. The palace was like a bottomless pit. Later, I heard about your deeds. He smiled. A woman who could take care of her younger brother and turn him around in the cold palace, creating such a feat. I suddenly wanted to see how you, who was in the same situation as me, did it. However, I had to earn money and couldn't leave. In the end, I came up with the idea of becoming a singer and traveling around the world. Gong Yimo opened her mouth and couldn't speak for a long time. No wonder she had never heard of the world's number 1 beauty in her previous life. It was because of her that Kim Yoon had a completely different life in this life. Gong Yimo suddenly felt full of confidence. Fate could be changed. Therefore, while she could save the tragedy, she could also fulfill her dreams. She firmly believed. It was late and warm here. However, far away in Dayu State, the marquee residence was brightly lit at night, with people coming in and out from time to time. Eldest Miss was about to get married, but the marquee mother fell ill. If she really died, Eldest Miss would have to mourn for 3 years. How could the crown prince wait for 3 years? Su Miaolon anxiously looked at the doctor who was walking around in circles in the room. It was late at night, but she didn't feel sleepy at all. How could she fall ill just like that? She secretly gritted her teeth, but in her heart, she hated the doctor for causing her trouble. She only needed 5 days. In another 5 days, she would marry the crown prince. She had thought it through. When the doctors came out, she would make them think of all ways to drag it out for 5 days. While she was thinking about how to persuade her father to use the tiger and wolf medicine, she didn't expect a cry to come from the room. Then, an old mama sorrowfully said, "The old lady died." When this voice reached Su Miaolan's ears, it was like a sudden clap of thunder. She only felt that the world was spinning, and she almost fainted. However, she was quickly supported by her mother who had been standing beside her. "Don't panic," the Marquis wife, Madame Zhang, whispered. Su Miaolan wiped away her tears. "What should I do, mother? How could she die? How could she?" Madame Zhang hurriedly covered her mouth. Seeing that no one was paying attention, she lowered her voice and whispered in her ear. "No matter what you're thinking now, cry for me. You can't complain." Su Miaolan was already sad, and her mother's words made her even more sorrowful. She didn't die earlier or later. She really died at the right time. Her beautiful eyes revealed a bit of resentment, and she cried in a low voice, as if she was really sad. However, in her heart, she was brewing a sinister plan. She didn't care. So what if she died? The position of the crown prince's wife could only be hers. Chapter 185. With such a huge commotion in the Marquis residence, many people were unable to sleep. The news of the old lady's death quickly spread to many people's residences. Qi Manor's lights were still on, and Gong Dai was still awake. At this moment, he was furiously writing on the table. Countless ideas and ideas poured out like water. These ideas were given to him by Gong Yimo, and he used them all with ease. Moreover, he created the value that they should have. "But royal sister, where are you?" Just as Gong Dai was about to send the letter to the store manager, he received two pieces of news. The first was about the Marquis residence. He raised his eyebrows slightly, looked in the direction of the Eastern Palace, and smiled faintly. His good brother, who was known for his benevolence, had something to do with this matter. But in any case, it had nothing to do with him. It didn't matter if Su Miaolan couldn't marry the crown prince. After all, the empress was still alive. Therefore, he threw this matter aside and looked at the second piece of news. There was only one sentence on the second piece of paper. Gong Yimo is suspected to have appeared at the border of Yuheng. He happily read it several times, repeatedly confirming it. Then, he clenched the letter in his hand. His chest rose and fell slightly, and his pair of black jade eyes burst out with light. Royal sister. He finally had news of her. The next day, it snowed heavily in Yuheng, but no matter how cold the snow was, it couldn't compare to the coldness of one's heart. Early in the morning, corpses were continuously dragged out of the Cloud Palace, leaving a trail of blood on the ground. On the dazzling white, there was a shocking red. Only Jin Sheng's roars could be heard in the entire hall. He seemed to have gone crazy, and his eyes were scarlet red. Below, the eldest prince, Jin Zhou, was beaten to the point of dying. His nose was bruised and his face was swollen, and he couldn't speak. He deserved to be unlucky. Originally, it was late at night, and the Cloud Palace was filled with screams. No one dared to go and look. When it finally calmed down, the first prince rushed over. After asking about the situation, he rushed in under the guise of escorting the emperor. The ugly side of the two men was exposed to the world. His scream also woke up Jin Sheng, who was deep in thought. When he realized that he was under a man, his brain was immediately burned by anger. Coincidentally, his hand touched a hard object. When he realized that it was a dagger, he stabbed it without thinking. Poor Rucha was still enjoying himself, but his lower body was in severe pain. He had actually been crippled by Jin Sheng with a single slash. His screams attracted the attention of the guards around him. When they saw the miserable state of their prince, how could they bear it? They quickly fought with the emperor's men. Jin Sheng's face was even more distorted. He struggled to prop up his torn body and resentfully looked at the culprit, Jin Zhou. He wished he could tear him to pieces. It's over. It's all over. He, an emperor, was actually... If he couldn't kill all of them, how could he still have the face to live in this world? Although Rucha had brought many people, this was Yuheng's palace after all. His men were gradually killed. Jin Sheng originally wanted to kill Rucha and the first prince together, but enough Scylla arrived in time and saved the two. Now, Rucha had been sent for treatment, and Jin Zhou was inevitably beaten up. This night could be said to be chaotic. When enough Scylla walked into the main hall, Jin Sheng's throat was hoarse from screaming. He sat on the dragon throne and panted violently, thinking, who hasn't been killed yet? So when he saw an of Scylla, who he had always relied on, his eyes were filled with murderous intent. An of Scylla's face stiffened under his gaze, but he still respectfully bowed. His tone was earnest as he said, Your Majesty, please calm down. Don't fall into that evil person's trap. Jin Sheng sneered, but because it touched on his sore spot, his face became ferocious. Evil person? He looked at an of Scylla unkindly. The one who wanted us to cooperate with Lu Yi was you. The one who wanted us to give our son to him was also you. Now, tell me, who is this evil person? An of Scylla broke out in a cold sweat at his words. He knelt down with a thump. Your Majesty, I'm innocent. Even if you lend this subject more courage, this subject still wouldn't dare to attack you. His eyes flashed with resentment, and he suddenly said, In this subject's opinion, this matter is the second prince's doing. Otherwise, why would it be? Your Majesty instead of him? Jin Sheng narrowed his eyes. You mean, that little bastard harmed us? Thinking of this, he flew into a rage. Guards, go capture that little bastard and put him to death by 1,000 cuts. Hold on, hold on. An of Scylla was delighted. He hurriedly got up and moved forward. Now that Rucha is so badly injured, if we don't give Lu Yi an explanation, I'm afraid there will be trouble. How about we push all the blame onto Kim Yun? Let's say that Rucha saw his beauty and wanted to take it by force. In the end, he was injured by Kim Yun, so let's make him the scapegoat. What do you think? Before Jin Sheng could speak, there was a sudden commotion at the door. Kim Yun pushed the guards aside and strode in. He looked at Jin Sheng and said, Imperial Father, are you still going to be deceived by him? Why don't you think that he's the one who schemed against you? You're slandering me. An of Scylla looked at him gloomily. Guards, how are you guarding the door? Quickly take him down. But this time, Jin Sheng strangely didn't listen to him. Instead, he looked at an of Scylla coldly and motioned for Kim Yun to continue. Imperial Father, let's not talk about anything else. Let's talk about the power in the palace. Who else can play you and Prince Lu Yi together in the palm of their hands? He smiled bitterly, but his eyes looked coldly at an of Scylla. He faintly said, If I had the ability, last night, I wouldn't have been. Speaking of this, his eyes were filled with grief and he couldn't continue. Jin Sheng remembered that his son didn't have any power in the palace. The only ones who could do this were an of Scylla and Jin Zhou, who were highly valued by him. And the two of them had always been on good terms. Jin Zhou even personally led people to break into the scene. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but gnash his teeth. He fiercely stared at an of Scylla. An of Scylla anxiously said, Your Majesty, he's speaking irresponsibly. Kim Yun said, I didn't say it was you. Why are you so anxious? As he spoke, he looked deeply at Jin Sheng and sneered, Now, I'm already at the end of my road. I'm not afraid of anything. I only hope that Imperial Father won't be manipulated by others. Imperial Father, why didn't you think about why an of Scylla was so enthusiastic about Lu Ye's matter? He's afraid of offending Lu Ye's prince. I'm afraid that when the time comes, someone colluding with outsiders to rebel will be the truth. Imperial Father, take care of yourself. With that, he laughed and left. An of Scylla knelt on the ground again. His forehead was full of cold sweat. For the first time, he realized what it meant to kill with words. Jin Sheng had just suffered such a big blow. He was angry and suspicious at the same time. He would rather kill 100 people by mistake than let go of a single person. Compared to Kim Yun, who posed no threat at all and could be easily crushed to death, an of Scylla, who had obviously been trusted by him, touched his tense nerves more. Sometimes, as long as the Emperor suspects someone, it doesn't matter whether there's evidence or not, because all of your reasons will be used as excuses by him. And how to use people's hearts and say the most appropriate words at the most appropriate time. Words may not be unable to kill. In the cold palace, Gong Yimo was drinking wine while talking to Yunjin. Chapter 187. Gong Yimo did not leave for the entire night. She sat on the roof like a statue and guarded the entire night. This night was extremely difficult for Yunjin to endure, but it was even more so for Gong Yimo. Listening to the cries that did not stop for the entire night, she suddenly felt that she might have done something wrong. For such a person, she might be weak and useless, or she might be a crybaby. But she was also clean and pure. She was the first person who dared to tell her that she did not want to receive the emperor's favor because he was ugly. Gong Yimo remembered a few days ago when they were chatting. She secretly said that she wanted to go to the folk music hall to dance again. She said that was when she was at her most beautiful and everyone fell for her dance steps. She really wanted to go again. Perhaps she was indeed causing trouble for Kim Yoon, but Kim Yoon was also happy to endure it. This kind of cute and fragile woman really made people unable to not protect her. The next day, when the emperor left, he had a smile on his face. The haze between his brows was dispelled. Gong Yimo coldly watched him walk away and quickly jumped down. When she entered the door, Yunjin was putting on her clothes. She was shocked and tightly covered her chest like a bird startled by the twang of a bow. Gong Yimo saw the bruises on her body, and her eyes were filled with anger that she could not control. Jin Shang, that dog emperor, did he know how to treat a woman with tender feelings? Seeing that it was Gong Yimo, Yunjin was a little embarrassed and wanted to tidy herself up. But there was not a single part of her body that was intact. What was the point of covering up? These ambiguous marks made her feel ashamed. Seeing Gong Yimo sit over, she could not help but shrink into the bed. Don't move. Gong Yimo suddenly grabbed her. Under her palm, her body trembled slightly. She did not know if it was because of fear or because of the lingering fear from last night. Gong Yimo comforted her and then slowly pulled off the blanket in front of her chest. Together with half of her clothes, she exposed her to her eyes, delicate and fragile. Seeing that Gong Yimo was looking at her without saying anything, Yunjin said shyly, "Your Majesty, he has already promised me. He said that he will not send Yun to Lu Yi." There was a little pride in her voice, as if she had already forgotten how she cried miserably last night and how she was treated. Gong Yimo suppressed the complicated feelings in her heart and praised, "I knew that no one but you could do it." Her words made her face slightly redden. Yunjin turned her body awkwardly. "Miss, don't look. My body is a withered flower and will only dirty your eyes." Gong Yimo took out a bottle of medicine. Madame Yunjin's body must be the prettiest in the world. Otherwise, how could she have given birth to Kim Yoon? Her fingers were coated with the medicine. The moment she touched her skin, Yunjin could not help but tremble. She closed her eyes tiredly. She actually allowed Gong Yimo to do whatever she wanted. The faint fragrance of the ointment soothed her expression quite a bit. Her nerves, which had been tense since just now, also gradually relaxed. She suddenly said, "Miss, you did not leave last night, right?" Gong Yimo paused and softly said, "I knew it." Yunjin smiled. With her eyes closed, her smile looked a little miserable. She suddenly said, "Actually, there were many times last night that I could not take it and wanted to ask you for help." Gong Yimo could not help but breathe lightly. She was almost holding her breath as she listened to her. "I knew that as long as I shouted, you would definitely come to save me. You even lectured Yun the last time. Miss, you are also a person who does not care about the consequences sometimes." Her eyes were half open. Her long eyelashes were trembling slightly, as if she was afraid. "But I endured it. Every time, I would tell myself to endure it a little more. Just a little more and everything would be fine. I did not expect that once I endured it, it would be the entire night. It was like a nightmare." Gong Yimo lowered her eyes and did not speak. She continued, "Actually, I hoped that you would rush in and save me last night. That way, I would have an excuse. It's not that I did not have the courage. It's not that I did not want to persist. It was you who interrupted my persistence, but you did not." She did not hold it in and did not rush in. That low cry made her feel guilty, but it did not make her lose her composure. "That's why I hated you for a long time last night." After Yunjin finished speaking, she turned around and looked at Gong Yimo with her eyes wide open. "Also, I realized that when I hate someone, time passes faster. So I hate you even more." Gong Yimo held the medicine bottle in one hand and looked at her with the other hand in the air. Her expression was actually a little pitiful. Then why don't you hate the emperor? Gong Yimo said indifferently. The person who directly abused you, the person who caused all of your suffering, why don't you hate him? Gong Yimo's question made Madame Yunjin open her mouth slightly, not knowing how to refute. Because you are a coward. Gong Yimo looked at her with a flickering light in her eyes. Her tone was also very soft, as if she was not refuting her. In your heart, the emperor is high and undefeatable. But in your heart, I'm just like you, a woman. But I'm much more free than you. Hating him makes you feel afraid because you feel that you can't possibly be his opponent. But hating me becomes much easier because in your heart, no matter how strong a woman is, she is always weak. No. Yunjin's face turned pale. Being exposed so blatantly was almost unbearable. She held her head in pain and shook her head. It was not like that. Do you still remember the wish you told me a few days ago? Yunjin suddenly stopped moving. She lowered her head and did not say a word. You said that you wanted to go to the folk music hall to dance and experience the feeling of making the world fall for your dance again. Do you still remember? When Gong Yimo said this, she suddenly loosened the collar in front of her chest a little in annoyance. You are right. Sometimes, when I am impulsive, I do not care about the consequences. So I am asking you now, do you still want to go? If you say yes, I will risk my life to send you out. Whether it succeeds or not, I will do what I say. Yunjin heard this and looked up at her. Her eyes were actually glistening with tears. I am sorry. Everything that happened that day, just treat it as a dream. Why? Because it is already too late. After saying this, Gong Yimo heard a group of people rushing over and singing from afar. The imperial edict has arrived. This one has come to congratulate your highness. Gong Yimo hid to the side. Not long later, a group of people walked in. They saw that Yunjin's clothes were disheveled and quickly came over to help Yunjin put on her clothes. During the entire process, Yunjin's expression was indifferent, as if she had become a different person. The leading eunuch was full of smiles. Your Highness Imperial Concubine Yun is so fortunate. His Majesty has not forgotten you after so many years. It can be seen that he has deep feelings for you. Yunjin suddenly glanced at him. That eunuch quickly reacted and slapped his mouth with a smile. Look at this servant's lousy mouth. What Imperial Concubine Yun? It is clearly Imperial Concubine Yun. Your Highness, please do not be angry. Yunjin suddenly spoke. You misspoke about my position. That eunuch's face paled. Who knew that a salted fish in the cold palace would make a comeback? Just as he wanted to say some flattering words, Yunjin spoke without even looking at him. Since you misspoke, then slap yourself. Her words caused everyone to be stunned. Who did not know that Yunjin had a cowardly personality? But that eunuch was not a normal person. He quickly slapped himself rather viciously. The slapping sounds echoed throughout the cold palace. As he slapped himself, he said, This servant was wrong, begging your highness for forgiveness. Gong Yimo watched from the shadows as Yunjin punished the eunuch. That gaze of hers went from slight unease and fear to pleasure and then to awe. Then, with the sound of slapping, she finished changing her clothes. She glanced at the place where Gong Yimo was hiding and looked around before smiling faintly. In the future, this one is Imperial Concubine Yun. Everything here, burn it. After saying this, she walked out with large strides. When the palace servants heard this, they quickly took out matches and lit candles. What a joke! This was the emperor's beloved. They could not afford to offend her. In the midst of the flames, Gong Yimo watched as Yunjin left. After the flames started burning, Yunjin also turned around at the right time. Although they could not see each other, their gazes seemed to meet. One look, resolute. Chapter 188. In the blink of an eye, more than a year had passed. Gong Yimo was already 15 years old. At this moment, she was sitting under a pergola by the river. Looking at the progress and the busy workers, she estimated that the secret river channels would be opened up within this month. Thinking about the rolling in money after the river channels were opened up, She happily drank herbal tea and looked at the green mountains and clear waters. She was very satisfied. After more than a year of hard work, Gong Yimo became a little rich woman again. With the support of Imperial Consort Yun, Gong Yimo and Kim Yun joined forces to take over one pawn shop after another and opened a bank. In this year and a half, the emperor basically spent most of his time at Yun Jin's place. Pillow talk was also free. When a country was mobilized, it was very powerful. In addition, Kim Yun was very generous. Although the bank was still in its early stages, it earned a lot of money every day. Kim Yun finally lived a temporarily stable life. However, all of this was built on his mother's sacrifice. Therefore, he could only work hard to live up to his mother's sacrifice. However, Yun Jin was no longer the Yun Jin of the past. More than a year ago, when the eldest prince was still recuperating, he was sent to Luyi with Rucha. His pitiful mother cried her heart out. She even knelt outside Imperial Consort Yun's palace for a day and a night, begging her to be merciful. However, she knelt until she fainted in the end. She did not see Yun Jin even once. Later, the fourth prince also lost his hearing because of an ear disease due to improper treatment. Half of his ear was cut off and his face was damaged. He was considered a cripple. Because of this, his mother went to find trouble with Yun Jin more than once. In the end, one day, Yun Jin fell into the water because of her and the emperor demoted her by 3 ranks. Now, in the palace, even the empress had to avoid her. Gong Yimo was used to the disputes in the harem. Anyway, whatever she wanted to do, Kim Yun would naturally help her. Therefore, she was happy to be an advisor. In any case, as long as Kim Yun asked, Yun Jin would definitely agree. Therefore, she had not seen Yun Jin for a long time. At this time, someone sent a secret letter. It turned out that it was news from Dayu State. After becoming rich, she had been paying attention to the movements of the 4 major countries, especially the situation in Dayu State. Even she could not explain why she was constantly paying attention to these news, but she could not help but want to listen to these bits and pieces. When the Marquis Zhengguo's funeral was held, the empress wanted to reject this marriage. However, later on, Miss Su fell into the water and the crown prince saved her. The crown prince ruined her reputation. The crown prince then promised in front of everyone that he would wait for Su Miaolon for 3 years. This move shocked the entire court. He looked at the people outside busily digging the canal and said half-jokingly, "I heard that you have a powerful weapon in your hands that can cut through mountains and water. What, are you so scared that you don't dare to use it now?" Gong Yimo poured him a cup of herbal tea and giggled. "It's not that I don't need it. It's not time yet." As she spoke, she asked with schadenfreude, "Why did you come out? Didn't your mother consort say that if you don't choose a consort, she won't let you out?" Speaking of mother consort, he glanced at Gong Yimo. "Mother consort misses you. Every time, she would ask you why you don't go into the palace to see her." "Forget it." Gong Yimo shrugged. "Your Yuheng Imperial Palace is too chaotic. I won't go." Today, Yuheng Imperial Palace could be said to be extremely extravagant. They imitated the ancient people in digging wine pools. All the palace servants in the wine pools could only wear light muslin. Moreover, they were all beauties. Everywhere was filled with the fragrance of wine and meat and the scent of women's cosmetics. Moreover, the music was incessant. It made people immersed in it, unable to see the light. It was said that Jin Shang was addicted to it every day. Now, even the memorials were read by Kim Yun. Speaking of this, Kim Yun smiled embarrassedly. He also did not know what to say. His mother consort had changed. She was clearly the same person, but sometimes he felt a little scared. For example, imitating Shang Zhou's wine pool and meat forest. It was Yun Jin's request. Only, she still cared about him. But sometimes, the way she looked at him was strange. There was a feeling that he could not describe. At this time, Gong Yimo raised her cup and faintly said, "You have to be careful of your mother consort." Kim Yun smiled. Just as he was about to say that she was joking, Gong Yimo said another sentence. This sentence, "I'm serious." She looked outside and revealed a meaningful smile. A weak person could not suddenly become brave and strong. The only way she could become strong was to twist and finally become abnormal. Let's not talk about this. Kim Yoon suddenly changed the topic. I can't leave these 2 days, but I have already sent a letter to Dayu State's crown prince. I told him about the cooperation of the canal. He is very interested and asked me to send someone to contact one of his subordinates. That person is in charge of repairing the tributaries that we need. I hope that you can meet him in my place. Chapter 189. Kim Yoon smiled again. This is a serious matter. Other than you, I really don't have a better candidate. Gong Yimo was a little hesitant. She was going to Dayu State, and she was going to meet Gong Che's people. Although, the people who followed Gong Che during the construction of the canal were all replaced by Gong Che, it was hard to guarantee that they wouldn't be familiar faces. If she went, even if she disguised herself, it would be a little dangerous. Seeing her hesitation, Kim Yoon looked at her and said a little forcefully, "It's settled then. This matter belongs to none other than you. You'll make the trip for me." Gong Yimo thought that it shouldn't be a big problem, so she agreed. Moreover, her people had given up because they left in a hurry, and because they were afraid of being found, they hadn't contacted each other for more than a year. This time, they could contact each other and restart the plan. After settling this matter, Kim Yoon seemed very relaxed. It was still better here. When he was in the palace, he was almost out of breath. However, Gong Yimo put down her cup and said in a low voice, "Before I go, I have a very serious question to ask you." Kim Yoon glanced at her and raised his cup to drink tea. Although he didn't need to be a singer anymore, the moment he glanced over, his eyes moved, and it was a stunning sight. Gong Yimo wasn't moved by his beauty and said seriously, "I want to ask you something. I want to ask you, is it because you like me that you refuse to get married again and again?" There was a p sound. Fortunately, it wasn't directed at Gong Yimo. He wiped his mouth with a slightly red face and glared at her. "What nonsense are you thinking about now?" Gong Yimo looked at him with a smile, but deep in her eyes, there was a serious look. "I just want to confirm. If it's really because of me, I won't be wronged if the imperial concubine finds trouble with me in the future." Hearing this, Jin Yun gradually withdrew his smile and looked at her deeply. "It's not because of you." Then, as if to emphasize something, he said it again. "It's not because of you." Gong Yimo nodded in satisfaction when she saw that his answer was so straightforward, and his expression didn't seem to be fake. "Then I'm relieved. Hey, I won't be here for the construction. Remember to get someone else to keep an eye on it. I'll go pack up now and head to Dayu State." Seeing her so excited, Kim Yoon suddenly pulled her with some hesitation. "Are you coming back?" Gong Yimo was baffled by his question, but at the same time, she sighed. "Of course I'm back." She blinked. For the time being, there was no place for her in Dayu State. Kim Yoon heaved a sigh of relief and gradually let go of his hand. Watching her walk away step by step, Kim Yoon held his heart and sighed. He would never admit that he liked her, because she was like an eagle in the sky. She was not someone he could have. Therefore, all he had to do was to protect them. He could tell everyone in the world that he didn't like her. As long as he knew in his heart that it was a lie, that was enough. Gong Yimo changed her clothes and darkened her face. However, she still felt that this wasn't enough. She drew thick eyebrows and even dotted a mole on the side of her face. Her entire aura changed. She looked like a strategist who had traveled extensively. This was also her experience in disguising herself over the past year. This wasn't the first time she had wandered around Dayu State, but no one had recognized her. Firstly, it was because the people at the border didn't recognize her. Secondly, her skills were superb. However, she might have to meet some acquaintances this time, so she had to be more careful. It was actually very easy to disguise herself. The real challenge was to imitate a person's temperament. For example, a scholar had to imitate his refined, weak, and somewhat noble temperament. For example, a performer had to imitate his seemingly cold, arrogant, and inferior aura. His eyes had to be full of contradictions. After a period of practice, Gong Yimo could already act as an old man without makeup. Her expression and actions made it seem as if she had been possessed by an old man. Every time Kim Yoon saw her acting, he would have a strange expression. She had a lot of fun. With her life's ups and downs, this kind of disguise was very easy for her. Therefore, this time, she hypnotized herself in her heart. She was a strategist who had traveled extensively and was meticulous. She definitely wouldn't be recognized. She set off just like that. She headed all the way south. Her destination was Dayu State. Meanwhile, in the Qi Manor in the capital, there were more than 20 people kneeling on the floor of the bedroom. They had clearly just returned from court and hadn't even taken off their official robes. Judging from their ranks, they were all important officials ranging from 1st to 4th rank. A youth was lying on the bed. Although he was a youth, his aura was far more stable and cold than an adult's. Although he was an adult, his eyes were cold and clear. At first glance, he looked like he didn't know anything about the world. If there were outsiders here, they would definitely find it strange. Just who was this youth? Why was it that when he didn't speak, the people kneeling on the floor were already so afraid? What did you say just now? The moment the clear and unique voice sounded, the temperature in the room suddenly turned cold. Even though it was clearly a hot summer day, it made the leader's teeth chatter. You said that you failed? The youth slightly raised his eyebrows. His black, jade-like eyes fell on the leader, causing him to tremble and quickly kowtow. I beg your highness to give this official another chance. This time, the 4th prince was just lucky. Next time, this official will definitely not disappoint your highness. When he saw that Gong Dai didn't answer, his face turned pale with fright. His voice suddenly became louder and more hurried as he kowtowed again and again. I beg your highness to believe in this official one more time. I beg your highness to be magnanimous. Don't expose this official's crimes. This official swears with my life. Next time, I will definitely make sure that the 4th prince's position is not guaranteed. The position of the head of the Department of Cautious Punishment belongs to your highness. After he finished speaking, he led a group of people to kneel on the floor. They didn't dare to say more, afraid that they would annoy him. They fearfully waited for Gong Dai's final judgment. Gong Dai glanced at the people on the floor and smiled faintly. The royal sister once said that in a country, the most capable, the smartest, the boldest, and the most meticulous were the corrupt officials. Although the corrupt officials were hateful, if used well, they were also a sharp weapon. Therefore, he racked his brains to obtain the emperor's trust. Borrowing the emperor's imperial sword, he opened Zhao Prison and became the #1 anti-corruption official. All the corrupt officials were afraid of him, because once he found out, there were only 2 outcomes. First, he suppressed the evidence, and depending on the severity of the case, he asked the corrupt official to do something for him. If it was done, the case would be closed. As long as he didn't get a hold of the evidence the next time, he could basically escape with his life. But if it was a simple matter, how could it be worth a life? The things he asked people to do were all extremely tricky things. Danger and opportunity coexisted. Second, if you didn't agree and thought that someone else would come to save you, he would definitely let the emperor issue a decree to confiscate your family. At that time, not only would you see your entire family being fired, you would also be imprisoned in Zhao Prison. As for whether you could live until the day you were rescued, that would be fate. Chapter 190. Therefore, all of the officials in the capital had to act with their tails between their legs. However, with so many officials, even if they could endure it for a while, they couldn't endure it for a lifetime. They had to make arrangements for their daily expenses. Just based on their position, how could it be enough? Therefore, even though there was a strict crackdown now, there were still people who fell into Gong Dai's hands one after another. Therefore, Gong Dai's existence was a thorn in everyone's heart, a blade above their heads. However, he was deeply favored and had the imperial army in his hands. In the entire capital, no one had more military power than him. It could be imagined that he was an existence that made people both hate and fear him. Now, Gong Dai still wanted to climb up. Therefore, he could only abolish the disciplinary department set up by the founding emperor of the dynasty and expand the functions of Zhao Prison. He would swallow up the disciplinary department and become a new judicial organization. However, this Zhao Prison was different from the disciplinary department's 3 departments. He would make Zhao Prison only listen to the emperor and only listen to him. As for the fourth prince, not only did he have the duty of investigating, 2 of the 3 departments were his people. Naturally, he became the next target that Gongdai wanted to deal with. Unfortunately, last time, the 2 wrongful cases came out at the same time and left the disciplinary department in a terrible fix. After the emperor heard about it, he became furious and almost punished them. Coincidentally, at this time, Gure Fei Long suddenly revealed that she was pregnant. The emperor was overjoyed and suppressed this matter. What a pity, he almost succeeded. Gong Dai looked at the person in front of him, the right chief imperial censor, Zhou Buping. A dark light flashed through his eyes. This person was very capable, especially when his life was threatened. He was actually able to dig up 2 wrongful cases from over a decade ago. He was a talent. Although the emperor had lightly let go of the last matter, there must have been a seed of dissatisfaction and suspicion left in his heart. Once again, he had to hit the nail on the head. Therefore, he decided to give Zhou Buping another chance. Gong Dai thought as he got off the bed and walked in front of Zhou Buping. His approach made Zhou Buping's crouched body uneasy and shrink back. He was truly afraid of this youth, Gong Dai. He was like a ghost, always giving you a fatal blow when you least expected it. However, he was high up and didn't care about the life and death of others. Zhou Buping had seen the scene of Gong Dai supervising the execution with his own eyes. There were so many people, a total of 300 to 400 people. He did not even blink as he watched the executioner's knife fall. Many commoners screamed and didn't dare to look anymore. Their lives were more important. Moreover, Gong Dai never mistreated those who worked for him. This was one of the comforts. After everyone left, Gong Dai rubbed the space between his eyebrows and felt a little impatient. At this moment, Lo Chi walked in quietly and brought a piece of news. Your Highness, according to the spy's report, the tributaries you mentioned are almost at the border with Yuheng. Gong Dai's black eyes lit up and his spirit was lifted. Back then, in order to persuade him to help build the canal after he returned from the West Continent, Gong Yimo had told him her plan. Therefore, even though Gong Yimo's whereabouts were unknown, he could still wait for her at the place where she would appear. There was news that Yuheng was also building the canal, and it was in the direction of Dayu State. Then, in the territory of Dayu State, she would definitely not let go of the tributaries that were built according to the blueprint she had left behind. Therefore, it didn't matter where she was in Yuheng, or whether she was working for the second prince of Yuheng. As long as she hadn't given up on her plan to smuggle herself into Yuheng, he would have a chance to meet her. Thinking of this, he quickly got up and prepared to leave the residence. Lo Chi asked, Your Highness, what are you going to do? Enter the palace. But you just asked for leave from His Majesty yesterday, saying that you were ill and needed rest. What reason do you want to use this time? Gong Dai was obviously in a very good mood, and he actually started to explain. The capital is becoming more and more clean under Imperial Father's rule. Then, I'll go out and see if there are any parasites that have not been removed. Speaking of this, his eyes were smiling, as if he was just a youth who was about to go out and have fun. His eyes were full of longing. He was not worried that this suggestion would be rejected. The people of the capital were eager for him to leave, so they would try their best to facilitate this so that he could leave quickly. Unfortunately, if they thought that they could sit back and relax after he left the capital, they were too naive. Chapter 191. At the same time, Gong Che received the news as well. In fact, when he received Kim Yoon's letter, he was already tempted. Immerse's blueprint had been designed in such a way so that she could connect with Yuheng. Firstly, it was for smuggling purposes. Secondly, it was also for her wish to establish trade between the 4 countries in the future. Furthermore, Kim Yoon had been following the original plan to repair it. Who knew if Immerse was in Yuheng? Because he was afraid of scaring her away, Gong Che purposely said that he couldn't leave, but he would send someone to contact Kim Yoon's people. If Immerse was really involved in this matter and had been in Yuheng for more than a year, then she would definitely be one of the people he would meet this time. Therefore, Gong Yimo didn't expect that her trip, which she thought was safe, would have 2 people eyeing her covetously. It wasn't that she didn't think of this, but she didn't expect that someone would be so attentive and try their best to capture her every move. Therefore, she let down her guard. She was prepared to cross the mountains to bypass the checkpoint, but she inadvertently found something interesting. As she thought about it, she opened her palm. There were 2 gray stones with black clay on them. Limestone. If it weren't for the fact that she didn't have the energy to improve the furnace and didn't have any ores to calcine the fire bricks. Otherwise, she could have made cement to pave roads. It seemed that when she had time, she would have to go mining. Some rare metals were very helpful for forging, such as the furnace. Once refractory materials were added, the furnace's temperature would be greatly increased. It was a great help for smelting. However, these were all too far away. She wrapped the stones in a handkerchief and kept them in her arms as she continued walking. At this speed, she would probably reach Dayu State in 2 days. Just like that, she carried a strange feeling of anticipation as she reached Dayu State. Dayu State and Yuheng shared many borders, and the place she was at belonged to Shi and before she transmigrated. The local food was very special, and it whetted her appetite. "Come, sir. Your noodles." The waiter left after putting down a bowl of noodles. The thick noodles were enough to whet anyone's appetite. Gong Yimo ate in big mouthfuls, playing the role of a man to perfection. "Have you heard? Zhang Yuanwei's strange illness has been cured." Another voice quickly asked, "Who is it? He actually has such great ability." "I'm not sure. I heard that he's a young man who looks like a celestial being. He saved someone with just a pill. I heard that he looks like he's out of this world." Gong Yimo did not listen carefully. The world was so big, and it was normal for there to be a few outstanding people. It was not surprising. After eating the noodles, she was ready to continue her journey. However, she was a greedy person. He estimated that he still had 3 bottles of elixirs, so he could exchange for 3 types of food with this girl. Moreover, he cleverly chose the bigger food, thinking that he had taken advantage of her. Little did he know that elixirs on Mount Yunding were hard to come by. He was too well protected by his grandmaster. His 10-year-old mind did not know the price. Gong Yimo watched in a daze as he only took 3 and put them in the small bag he carried with him. Then, he put the elixirs in her hand, bowed, and left obediently. "Wait." Gong Yimo seemed to wake up from a dream and called out to him, "Is there anything else?" Qiu Xingfeng was in a difficult position as he grabbed his bag. Was this lady going back on her words? But what could he do? He was a vegetarian and didn't know what wild vegetables and fruits he could eat. He had been hungry for an entire day as he hurried through the mountains. Gong Yimo only needed to look at him to know what he was thinking. His actions, coupled with his clean eyes, were too easy to guess. Gong Yimo could not help but relax her tone. She asked softly, "Do you have a disciple?" When she asked this, she was very nervous. Her whole heart was nervous, but she did not know what answer she wanted to hear. Chapter 192. In her previous life, her master had brought her master to visit Dayu State. She had wanted to sneak away but was discovered by the palace servants. In a moment of desperation, she bumped into him and was saved by him. At that time, Qiu Xingfeng, who was only 11 or 12 years old, was very interested in the 3-year-old child. Coincidentally, in her previous life, Emperor Gong didn't like her. Seeing that Qiu Xingfeng liked her, he let her go. So she became his disciple. But in this life, she didn't have the heart to disturb his life. She wondered if there was someone else like her who bumped into his arms in a daze. Yes, Qiu Xingfeng felt strange but still answered honestly. His eyes had a trace of longing. "This time, I want to find her. That little girl didn't keep her word. She said she would come back in a month. She has been gone for half a year and hasn't come back to see me." His sad words made Gong Yimo's heart feel like it was being torn apart. She took a deep breath, and then another. However, Qiu Xingfeng could still sense her sadness. Moreover, he could sense that this lady was sad not because he had swapped the food, but because he had a disciple. Did she also want to be his disciple? That wouldn't do. Thinking of his little disciple's angry face, he said righteously, If you want to be my disciple, then forget it. I already have a disciple. If you don't have anything else, I'll leave now." As he spoke, he made a gesture of preparing to leave. Gong Yimou couldn't hold back her tears, and they fell again. Because she was in a hurry, she didn't bother to disguise herself. Her face turned pale. She cried for a long time, but Qiu Xingfeng didn't leave. Finally, she seemed to have thought through something. She took out some food again and stuffed it all into his arms. Then, she flew onto the horse and rode past him to leave quickly. Qiu Xingfeng was a little stunned. He glanced at the strange girl's back. Not wanting to waste anything, he happily put all the food into the small bag. Looking at the bulging bag, his expression was satisfied, but he was a little embarrassed. That girl just now seemed very sad. So there were actually so many people who wanted to be his disciple? Thinking of this, he happily decided to tell this news to his little disciple. As for the girl just now, he would probably never see her again in this life. Gong Yimou was also thinking the same thing. In this lifetime, she would probably never go to Mount Yunding. Hence, it would be impossible for her to see Qiu Xingfeng again. In this life, without her interference, perhaps he would be happier. At least, he wouldn't end up like he did in his previous life. Just like that, she hastened her journey and soon arrived at the place where Gong Che had agreed to meet. Wancheng. At the same time, Gong Che was already waiting there. In the past few days, he had heard reports from his subordinates that Immerse was nowhere to be seen. She must have disguised herself, which was why he could not find her. The meeting was scheduled to take place 3 days later at noon at the most famous restaurant in Wancheng City, Wanhonglu. He wondered if he had guessed wrongly. With this thought in mind, Gong Che became even more anxious. 3 days slowly passed in this kind of anticipation and torment. Gong Yimou raised her head and looked at the 3 huge words Wanhonglu. She was slightly surprised. In this restaurant, countless rich young talents gathered to discuss poetry and compose. Furthermore, the 10,000-word Zen tea was also the best. Hence, a rich young lady. A short man beside Gong Yimou was somewhat expectant and a little afraid. He also raised his head to look at the signboard and muttered, "Can I really go in?" This was a place where only rich talents could come. A poor scholar like him wouldn't be discovered and chased out, right? Gong Yimou said lightly, "What I asked you to memorize last night, you just have to memorize it. As for the rest, don't worry." As she spoke, she tossed a silver ingot to him. "This is the deposit." Looking at the silver ingot in his hand, the scholarly Huai felt a lot more confident. He then went in. Immediately, a waiter came to receive him, and he was led to the appointed room. Gong Yimou watched from behind with an indescribable expression. She was careless, but at this moment, she was cautious again. However, she didn't think too much about it. Instead, she felt that this matter was of great importance. If Gong Che came personally and she suddenly met him, how awkward would that be? However, perhaps he wouldn't be able to recognize her. Gong Yimou touched her face and felt a little more confident. The poor scholarly Huai was led to an extremely luxurious private room. He looked around curiously, but remembered Gong Yimou's words and restrained himself. Not long after, a young man walked in. When he saw Li Huai, he first frowned and then sized him up with an inquisitive expression. "Nice to meet you. This humble one is Su Yuan. May I know this brother's name?" Li Huai was somewhat at a loss as he hurriedly stood up and bowed. "This humble one is Li Huai. Greetings to young Master Su." Gong Yimou was sitting in the hall downstairs. When she saw that the person who came was Su Yuan, she couldn't help but feel a little surprised. Her eyes followed Su Yuan up the stairs. She didn't expect that he was actually following Brother Crown Prince. She looked at herself and felt that Su Yuan definitely wouldn't be able to see through her disguise. Why not meet him? However, after thinking about it, she decided to wait a little longer. When Su Yuan saw Li Huai, he felt very disappointed. Of course, there was someone who was even more disappointed than him, and that was Gong Che, who had already arrived at the secret room next door. He had been sizing Li Huai up from the moment he came in, but he didn't see a trace of Immerse on him. He originally thought that he was someone that Immerse had sent to test him, who knew that although this Li Huai looked timid, when he asked some questions, He spoke in an orderly manner and had quite the literary talent. In his disappointment, Gong Che stood up and left. When he was leaving, he passed by the hall. As he was feeling gloomy, he didn't raise his eyes to look. At this moment, a violent cough was heard. He subconsciously looked over and was shocked to find that the person's back seemed a little like a mower. He carefully stared at that person and took a few steps towards her. Who knew that in the next second, the person who was coughing suddenly slammed the table and scolded. "Waiter, come over here. Did you serve wine for this young master? I think it's horse piss." That vulgar and rough male voice disappointed Gong Che once again. His footsteps towards her stopped, then he flicked his sleeves and left without looking back. At this moment, the waiter came up with a wronged expression. "Sir, this is the best wine in the shop." When Gong Yimo saw that Gong Che had left, her tense back suddenly relaxed and she let out a long sigh of relief. Only the heavens knew that when she heard Gong Che's footsteps approaching, she was about to explode. Her small hands quickly patted her chest to relax. Then she stuffed an ingot of silver into the waiter's hands. Sorry, I was just joking. I'm really sorry." Although the waiter was baffled by her apology and received the silver, he still left satisfied, leaving Gong Yimo lying on the table speechlessly. Gong Che, he really came. Chapter 193. Gong Yimo was extremely glad that she knew how to change her voice and that Gong Che didn't know about it. She cleverly waited downstairs for a while before going up. Otherwise, wouldn't she be caught red-handed? She didn't understand why she was afraid of Gong Che. No, she was subconsciously avoiding him. It was probably because his eyes were too sorrowful when she asked him to have a child soon. It left a lingering impression in her heart. After calming herself down, Gong Yimo stood up and walked upstairs. There were many details to be investigated regarding the cooperation. Li Huai could only hide it for a while. At this moment, Su Yuan also sensed something. However, he only felt that Kim Yun didn't have a good eye for people, so he sent someone like Li Huai. At this moment, someone knocked on the door. Li Huai heaved a sigh of relief and said, "Young Master Su, please don't be impatient. My lord is here." Su Yuan's eyes widened. He subconsciously wanted to ask the attendant waiting outside to report to the crown prince. However, on second thought, the person who came might not be Gong Yimo. If that was the case, wouldn't the crown prince be happy for nothing? Thus, he endured it and eagerly waited for Su Yuan to open the door. As expected, he was disappointed again. The person who came was a dark-skinned young master. His appearance, temperament, and height were all different from the princess. When Gong Yimo saw Su Yuan, she hurriedly greeted him. Throughout the process, she maintained her male identity. Her actions were flawless. Then, she saw the anticipation in his eyes disappear bit by bit. "Young Master Shi, why didn't you come in with brotherly just now? Instead, you came in one after the other?" After sitting down, Su Yuan couldn't help but ask. Gong Yimo, who was also known as He Yu, smiled. "Something came up and I couldn't leave. My apologies, my apologies." Su Yuan was disappointed that he didn't get anything out of her. However, he still asked with a trace of luck. "Young master, is there anyone else on this trip?" Gong Yimo said calmly, "We're in a hurry. It's just me and brotherly." Su Yuan didn't harp on this question. After all, what they were going to discuss next wasn't something glorious. The fewer people there were, the better. After that, Li Huai had nothing to do, so Gong Yimo let him leave. "Brotherly, you should return to the relay station first." As she spoke, she stuffed another ingot of silver into his hands. She winked at him and said, "On the way here, I saw that the second stall on the left of Nong Chong Alley had good paintings. It's a pity that I didn't make it in time and couldn't stay. Buy them all. Bring them all to bring them back." Li Huai's face flushed red, because she was talking about his own stall. Thus, he hurriedly lowered his head, took the silver, and left. As he closed the door, he turned back to take a look and saw the two people in front of him beginning to talk. They were obviously dressed very low-key, but their words and actions, their expressions, and their mannerisms were clearly not ordinary people. This kind of people, he actually had the chance to come into contact with them. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but slowly close the door. Next, it was time for Gong Yimou and Su Yuan to discuss business. The amount of money for smuggling, the amount of manpower and material resources each side would contribute, and the number of troops each side would send, had to be written down one by one on paper. This was because the details of this discussion would be handed over to the leaders of both sides, so there was no room for carelessness. However, Gong Yimou knew that the crown prince wasn't as rich as Kim Yun. So, she intentionally or unintentionally went easy on him. In the end, the profits were split 40 to 60. But it didn't matter. Kim Yun had her, so he wouldn't lose out. By the end of the conversation, Su Yuan had completely forgotten about looking for Gong Yimou. His whole person was attracted by the other party's calm conversation and the incisive words that came out from time to time. He could feel the other party's concession. Her free and easy mind and extraordinary bearing made Su Yuan sigh with emotion. She was also a person with amazing talent. At the end, he stood up and bowed deeply. "Thank you, young master. I'll pass this brief discussion to my master. I hope that young master can stay in Wan City for a few more days. When the time comes, you can return with my master's handwritten letter." At this point, he was a little worried and raised his head to ask in embarrassment. "May I ask, young master, can you make the decision on behalf of your country's second prince?" Gong Yimou smiled confidently, then took out a private seal from her chest. The two words Kim Yun were especially clear on it. He didn't expect Yuheng's second prince to trust this person so much. This surprised Su Yuan, but at the same time, he also felt relieved. "So it is. I'll go back and report." Su Yuan excitedly took his leave. "I won't disturb young master." Gong Yimou stood up and returned the greeting. "I hope that this matter can be settled in the next few days so that I can return to report." Su Yuan smiled and said, "Definitely. My master also attaches great importance to this matter. He will definitely reply to you as soon as possible." Gong Yimou smiled and said, "Then I won't see you off. Goodbye." After Su Yuan left, Gong Yimou collapsed on the chair as if she had lost all her strength. She clutched her chest and trembled. She kept shouting in her heart that she was so nervous, so nervous. At the same time, she was secretly delighted. Even Su Yuan couldn't recognize her. Perhaps Brother Crown Prince couldn't recognize her either? What she didn't expect was that not only was the Crown Prince in Wan City, but a certain Prince Qi was also on his way here. However, he had encountered some trouble. "Your Highness, Wang City is just ahead. At this speed, we will reach Wan City in the evening of the day after tomorrow." Although Gong Dai was already a prince, he wasn't even 15 yet, so everyone still called him Your Highness. Gong Dai's lips curled up happily. He could feel that he was getting closer and closer to the royal sister. At this moment, a horse galloped in their direction. On the horse's back, a woman wearing a fiery red riding uniform shouted loudly, "Brother Jiu, wait for me." Gong Dai heard the voice from afar and was a little impatient. Feeling the low pressure coming from the palanquin, Lo Qi hurriedly increased his speed. However, how could a group of people be faster than a single person? Soon, the woman caught up. "Brother Jiu, why didn't you wait for me?" Blocking the carriage, although the woman was a little afraid of the aura of the person in the carriage, she still straightened her neck and blocked there. However, the horse under her was a little uneasy and kicked on the spot. Perhaps a beast's sense of danger was much stronger than a human's. Seeing that His Highness didn't have any intention to speak and seemed to be very unhappy, Lo Qi sighed and said, "Princess Xiaoqing, His Highness still has an urgent matter. I hope Princess Xiaoqing will move aside." Princess Xiaoqing, who was also Long Hanyin, glared at Lo Qi when she heard this. "Wherever you are going, I will also go. Bring me along." This wasn't something that Lo Qi could decide, so he shut his mouth and didn't speak again. At this moment, Gong Dai's extremely cold voice came from the carriage. "Move aside." Hearing that it was really Gong Dai's voice, Long Hanyin was overjoyed. Her imperial grandmother didn't lie to her. Chapter 194. Long Hanyan was the Empress Dowager's niece. Because her parents died early and she was weak and sickly, she was raised by the Empress Dowager. She doted on her very much and even requested the emperor to confer her the title of Princess Zhaoqing. But later on, her health deteriorated. In order to nurse her back to health, the Empress Dowager entrusted her niece to the perfected Yun Ding Mountain when he came to visit Dayu State's palace. It was only half a year ago that she returned to Dayu State. When she returned, the Empress Dowager was overjoyed. Especially when she saw that her health had improved, she was even happier. So even if her behavior was like a woman of the pugilistic world, she did not restrain her. Moreover, seeing that she was already 16, she hurriedly wanted to find a husband for her, who knew that she did not fancy anyone but fell for Gong Dai at first glance. This person made the women in the capital somewhat afraid when they mentioned him. He had raided too many houses, and whenever he raided their houses, the fate of these women was especially tragic. So, in front of fear, their feelings for his little girl faded and only fear was left. However, Long Hanyan relied on the Empress Dowager's favor and chased him several times. This time, she even chased him out of the palace. If they were in the palace, Gong Dai might still give her some face. But now outside the palace, Gong Dai slightly narrowed his eyes. If she did not know how to appreciate favors, although it would be troublesome, it was not impossible to make a move. Seeing that Gong Dai was so heartless to let her leave and was not the least bit moved, Long Hanyan was somewhat discouraged and also somewhat indignantly raised her neck. I won't let you. She was a chivalrous woman, not those unmarried women in the capital. She was not afraid of him, who knew that a short sword would suddenly shoot out from the sedan. It was too fast, and she was completely caught off guard. In the end, when the short sword pierced the horse's body, the horse below her gave a sad cry and immediately jumped out. Long Hanyan was caught off guard and tightly grasped the reins. She turned around and saw the carriages continue to move forward. She hurriedly let go of her hand and used Qinggong to land on the ground. However, she deliberately twisted her foot and fell to the ground. She cried loudly, Ninth brother, Wu-Wu, my leg is broken. Lo Chi took a look and was somewhat hesitant, but only one cold word from Gong Dai rang out from the carriage. Let's go. Even if he fell to his death, he wouldn't turn around to look, let alone break his neck. Seeing that the carriage didn't stop, and that her Qinggong wasn't good enough to catch up to the horse, she couldn't help but hammer the ground in frustration. I don't believe it. I can't catch you. Wanching Manor. Hearing Su Yuan's report and his high evaluation of that person, Gong Che looked at him strangely. That Li Huai looks very ordinary to me. Who would have thought that he would catch your eye? Su Yuan slapped his head and laughed. Look at me. Wrong. It's not the Li Huai from before. It's someone else. Gong Che quickly asked, the other one? He asked anxiously, who is it? Knowing what the crown prince was worried about, Su Yuan couldn't help but lower his head. Your Highness, it's a mister. He was delayed by some matters and only arrived later. Although he is young, he is very talented and speaks well. Moreover, he has the private seal of the second prince of Yuheng. Obviously, he is highly valued by him. Gong Che didn't give up and asked, are you sure it's a man? Su Yuan sighed in his heart and said, I'm sure. Gong Che frowned slightly. Emoer, she really didn't come? Thinking of this, his heart was filled with grief and he almost couldn't breathe. He had waited for her for so long. Why didn't she appear? Didn't she know how much he missed her? How could she be so heartless and leave just like that? She left so casually. She didn't even send him a single letter in the past year. Gong Dai was dejected. He took the detailed list from Su Yuan's hand and looked at it, then pulled himself together. Immerse values transportation the most. The shipyard she left behind is still in operation. I'm only looking after it. If she comes back, she definitely won't let that place go. After he seemed to be talking to himself, he lowered his head and seriously looked at the detailed list in his hand. He had to control the flow of these routes. Then, Immerse would appear sooner or later. Thinking of this, his eyes lit up again. It was as if he had entered a demon's trap, unable to extricate himself. Seeing Gong Che like this, Su Yuan couldn't help but sigh faintly. Who would have thought that the crown prince would have such feelings for his own sister? At first, they only thought that the crown prince was overly good to the princess. But they didn't expect that this kind of kindness didn't come from kinship. In the latter half of the night, Gong Che and a few of his confidants discussed for half the night and finally came up with a plan. Then, he stamped his private seal. As long as Kim Yun stamped his private seal, this matter would be considered a success. But there were some details that needed to be discussed again, so Su Yuan once again arranged to meet with Gong Yimo. On Gong Dai's side, they had already reached the border of Wan City. That night, they set up camp in the suburbs and the carriages started to rest. At this moment, a figure was slowly approaching. It was still Long Hanyan. She wouldn't give up so easily. She believed that Gong Dai was the same towards everyone and not only towards her. Thinking of this, her heart became even more fervent as she stared at Gong Dai's carriage with infatuation. She also didn't expect that she would fall in love with Gong Dai. Chapter 195. Therefore, as soon as he appeared, she saw him at a glance and could no longer avert her eyes. At this time, a woman was dragged out of the door. She cried and struggled desperately, especially when she saw Gong Dai. She didn't know where the strength came from, but she broke away from the Imperial Guard and directly threw herself at Gong Dai's feet, holding his feet tightly. Gong Dai's eyes finally moved from the account book to her. His eyes were cold, and he looked at her with lowered eyebrows. The cold feeling he gave off was like a good young master in a chaotic world, not a big villain who came to search and destroy the family. The woman looked at him and sobbed painfully. "Your Highness, please let me go. I don't want to go to the musical house. Please." She cried heartbreakingly, which was not beautiful at all. However, Gong Dai just stared at her indifferently, unmoved. At this time, the woman seemed to throw caution to the wind. She wiped her face with her sleeves and looked up. "Or I beg your Highness to accept me. I can be a slave or a maid. I can do anything." She tried to make herself look better, but the face swollen from crying was not beautiful at all. The Imperial Guard who was holding her saw that Gong Dai didn't move, so he didn't dare to act rashly. He only dared to stand aside and watch. However, he saw Gong Dai bend down and help the woman up. The woman was flattered and panicked. She sobbed and looked at him with a pair of eyes full of horror. She didn't dare to make a sound, but her eyes were gradually bursting with expectation. However, she was pushed into the arms of the Imperial Guard by Gong Dai. "Send her to the musical house." "Your Excellency." The woman's beautiful face turned pale, and she let out a miserable cry. But this time, she was held tightly and directly dragged away. It was an extremely cruel act, but Long Hanyan didn't feel disgusted when she saw it, especially when he stretched out his hand. Someone handed him a snow-white handkerchief. He carefully wiped his hands. His fingers were long and slender, and his fingertips seemed to glow under the sunlight. He was elegant and calm, cold and noble, mesmerizing. Perhaps in his heart, he would find excuses for his actions. Clearly, he could change a woman's fate with a single sentence, but he didn't do so. He must have his reasons. At least, that was what Long Hanyan thought back then. She fell in love at first sight and swore to marry him, no matter what his status was. Later, the Empress Dowager found out about her thoughts. Not only did she not object, but she was also somewhat happy. At that time, the niece that she originally wanted to marry Gong Dai had been seduced and eloped. So much so that she no longer had the face to mention marriage to Gong Dai. But when she saw Long Hanyan, her mind became active again, and she supported her initiative. She even promised that no matter what happened, she would help Long Hanyan clean up the mess. At this time, he grabbed Long Hanyan's neck with one hand and slowly leaned out of the sedan chair. His slender figure made Long Hanyan's feet leave the ground, and her whole body was sobbing in pain. He looked at her, and at this angle, the moonlight could only illuminate half of his face, making half of his face handsome like an immortal, and the other half, because of the darkness, indescribable expression. This person was clearly the devil. He was not what she thought at all. Unfortunately, this understanding was too late. Long Hanyan's eyes rolled back, and she felt that she was going to die. He really did not hesitate to kill her. Why? She just wanted to marry him. At this time, there was a sudden burst of energy. Gong Dai moved sideways slightly to avoid it, and Long Hanyan fell and landed in Qiu Xingfeng's arms. God knows, he originally wanted to go to the capital to find her, but he did not expect to meet her here, and there was actually someone who wanted to kill him. Qiu Xingfeng saw that Gong Dai's expression became angry and thought that this must be a bad person. Long Hanyan coughed violently, and when she saw that the person who saved her was Qiu Xingfeng, she hurriedly grabbed him and cried, Whoa, master. It hurts. My neck hurts. Her crying made Qiu Xingfeng even angrier. Who are you? Why do you want to kill my disciple? But Gong Dai just stood in the carriage and turned around. Because of the light, they could not see his expression, but they could feel his slightly probing gaze. This person, when he threw out a palm, the energy was actually very similar to the cultivation method that he and Royal Sister practiced. Chapter 196. Who are you? Gong Dai asked in a low voice. Qiu Xingfeng snorted. I'm not telling you. Bad guy. Yen'er, I'll teach him a lesson for you. Long Hanyan wanted to hold him back, but she thought that it would be good to let her master teach Gong Dai a lesson. She wanted him to know that she was not so easy to bully. Those who were chosen by her must obey obediently. So she hesitated for a while before letting go. She was very confident in Qiu Xingfeng's martial arts. Although Qiu Xingfeng's intelligence was not high, he was a martial arts genius. Not only did he cultivate the supreme technique of wind and nature, but he had already reached the 5th realm. Gong Dai could not possibly be his opponent. She was secretly hoping that her master could avenge her, but she was also afraid that her master would not control his strength and hurt him. After all, his intelligence was not high. As for Gong Dai winning, she did not think of this possibility. Very few people knew how good Gong Dai's martial arts were. Usually, he did not need to make a move and things would be settled. So he always gave people the impression that he was a cold and indifferent young master. And the incident in the Cold Palace had happened 5 or 6 years ago. So people gradually forgot that this person dared to break into the palace alone when he was only 9 years old and massacred the 3 stages. How could people forget his own danger because of his ruthless methods? So when Gong Dai and Qiu Xingfeng exchanged blows, Long Hanyan's eyes widened in horror. She found that Gong Dai's strength was on par with her master's. They seemed to be using the same technique, and their realms were the same. How could it be? That was a technique unique to Mount Yunding, and her master was a martial arts genius. He had a famous teacher to teach him. Not only was he rich in resources, he also practiced hard every day to achieve what he had now. What did Gong Dai have? Was he just a prince that no one cared about in the Cold Palace? He was probably bullied every day and did not even have enough to eat. How could he be more powerful than her master? In the process of exchanging blows, Gong Dai naturally found out that their techniques were similar. He could not help but raise his eyebrows slightly. However, Qiu Xingfeng didn't care at all. He didn't consider this at all. He only felt that his opponent was extremely powerful. It made him feel as if he was facing his teacher. In terms of martial arts, Qiu Xingfeng was actually a little better. But Gong Dai was more ruthless than him. What was supposed to be a smooth martial art was actually extremely fierce when he used it. Therefore, the two of them were actually evenly matched in their battle. The two sides separated by a palm. Qiu Xingfeng retreated a few steps until he was in front of Long Hanyan, while Gong Ju flipped over and landed lightly on the carriage. Even the horse didn't move. It was actually a draw. Qiu Xingfeng felt that it was inconceivable. He panted slightly and realized that he actually didn't have the upper hand. This made him feel very defeated. How was he going to explain this to his little disciple? As for Long Hanyan, she was even more surprised. After being surprised, she was scared. If her master couldn't stop him, then she wouldn't be killed, right? When she thought of the suffocation she felt when he grabbed her by the throat and his undisguised killing intent, a gust of wind blew past, causing her body to tremble. The originally quiet forest was disturbed by the wind, and the leaves rustled. And Gong Dai looked down at them from above and spoke again. "Who are you?" This was the second time Gong Dai asked this question. But because he was equally matched with Qiu Xingfeng, this time, Qiu Xingfeng was much more honest and answered in a muffled voice. "I am Qiu Xingfeng. We are from Mount Yunding." Mount Yunding. Information about Mount Yunding flashed through Gong Dai's mind, but it was very little. The people there were very low-key and mysterious, but it was quite famous in the extreme south. "The martial art you used just now, is it unique to Mount Yunding?" Gong Dai asked again. This time, Qiu Xingfeng finally realized that the other party's martial art was the same as his. He couldn't help but be surprised. "Yes, but why do you know?" He looked suspiciously at Gong Dai. Could it be that he had a junior brother that he didn't know about? His words made Gong Dai ponder deeply. If it was really unique, then why did Royal Sister know the martial arts of Mount Yunding? And she knew everything about it. So Gong Dai didn't answer his question. Instead, he asked a strong question. "Do you know Gong Yimo?" Gong Yimo? Qiu Xingfeng and Long Hanyan muttered this name in their hearts. Qiu Xingfeng felt strange, while Long Hanyan felt angry. She didn't expect that one day, she would hear another woman's name from Gong Dai's mouth. Even though she had taken care of him since he was young, she still couldn't accept it. So she silently remembered this name that was widely known in Dayu State. For the first time, she remembered it in her heart with some hatred. "I don't know her," Qiu Xingfeng answered. "You don't know her?" Gong Dai frowned slightly. He was most curious about Gong Yimo's background. She was too mysterious. She knew everything and knew everything. Also, she was broad-minded, as if nothing could be difficult for her. She wasn't afraid of anyone in the world. But where did she come from? Why was she different from all the women in the world? Seeing Qiu Xingfeng nod in a daze, Gong Dai's frown deepened. He suddenly felt a bit depressed. Forget it. One day, he would find out all the secrets of the royal sister. There was no need to rush. At this time, the others ran back. Seeing the people lying on the ground, they thought there were assassins and quickly became alert. Looking at his eager eyes, Gong Yimo suddenly felt uncomfortable. She sighed. She said, "If you meet again, will you agree to be brother and sister again?" She should not have said this, but when she saw his face turn pale, she felt even more uncomfortable. Brother and sister? Gong Che looked at her and then at the dagger. After a long time, he smiled bitterly. "I will agree to be the manager. However, I also hope that you can pass on a message for me." Gong Yimo gestured for him to go ahead. Her movements were flawless. Gong Che looked at her as if he was looking at someone else through her. Finally, he sighed helplessly. "Please tell her that it doesn't matter what relationship she wants, as long as she comes back." Gong Yimo was stunned again. She could not tell what she was feeling. After a long time, she came back to her senses and said in a muffled voice, "I will definitely pass on the message." After saying this, Gong Yimo tried to change the topic and talk to him about something else. During this time, Gong Che kept looking at her with a deep and probing gaze. It made her feel uncomfortable. Soon, she got up to leave. "Will Sir be leaving tonight?" Before leaving, Gong Che raised his teacup and asked. Gong Yimo nodded. "This matter cannot be delayed. I will leave tonight." Gong Che did not say anything. He just stood up and smiled. "In that case, I will send you off. Please." Chapter 198. At this time, the sky was gradually darkening. Gong Yimo and Gong Che walked side by side on the streets, each with their own thoughts. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Gong Yimo pondered. Now, her disguise skills were not just a little better than before. Moreover, she could imitate the charm that was once the most difficult to conceal to perfection now, so there shouldn't be a problem. But when she thought of how Gong Che recognized her at a glance at Gong Dai's celebratory banquet, she felt a little uncertain. Thinking of this, they had unknowingly walked to the edge of the city. Gong Yimo heaved a sigh of relief and bowed to Gong Che. "Thank you, Crown Prince, for sending me off. But in the end, we must part. In the future, we will still meet again." She lowered her head, but after a while, Gong Che spoke again. "Sir, didn't someone come with you earlier? Where did that surly go?" Gong Yimo raised her head, her expression unchanged. This matter went smoothly. This lowly one asked him to go back and report the good news. Gong Che nodded and pointed to the city wall. "It's still early. Would Sir be willing to tour the city gate with me?" Gong Yimo paused and glanced at the city wall. She smiled and said, "Then this lowly one will be disrespectful to refuse." She felt that her face was about to stiffen from smiling. She followed behind Gong Che, who was deep in thought, and walked up the city gate tower. She muttered to herself, did he find out or not? Or was it because she was too anxious and took out the dagger for the exclusive fleet, so it aroused his suspicion? Only when the two of them reached the top of the city wall, and the cool summer wind blew did Gong Yimo feel refreshed. At this time, Gong Che finally spoke. "Do you know, if she was here now, what would I do?" He didn't use the word I, but used the word I. This made Gong Yimo's heart skip a beat. "What would you do?" Gong Che suddenly looked at her. The people on the city wall had all retreated because of their arrival, but the torches illuminated his pupils, giving off a mysterious feeling. "I will hug her and never let her leave." His words made Gong Yimo pause, not knowing how to answer. Seeing that she was in a difficult position, he grinned. "I'm just kidding. I won't do anything." As he spoke, he looked away and sighed softly with his hand on the city wall. How could I bear to do anything to hurt her? Gong Yimo listened to Gong Che's gentle and serious tone and suddenly felt a little guilty. As a member of the Shiryu family, she did not know how to respond, so she listened quietly. Perhaps Gong Che just wanted her to pass on a message. He raised his head to look at the moon, leaving behind an exquisite side profile, gentle and mature. This kind of him could easily make the hearts of some young girls palpitate, such as her in the past. While Gong Yimo was lost in her thoughts, Gong Che sighed faintly. "If she's here, I just want to tell her that I miss her very much." Gong Yimo finally couldn't help but say, "She's your sister." He laughed. "Many people have said this to me before." He looked at Gong Yimo in a daze, as though he was looking at another person through her. "Sir, have you ever liked anyone before?" Gong Yimo couldn't help but think of her previous life. In her previous life, at the beginning, she liked him very much, very much. However, the flames of war and killing later on had erased all her feelings, including love. She didn't hate him, so naturally, she didn't love him. Therefore, she said softly, "I liked someone before." Gong Che smiled faintly. "I didn't expect Sir to be such a sentimental person." "Then, Sir, you must be able to understand my feelings." He looked dazed, as though he was very lost. "It's a kind of, sometimes tossing and turning, sometimes feeling as though I'm in the clouds, sometimes heartache, and sometimes missing someone deeply. I didn't understand this feeling in the past, but later on, I did. It's just that the person who made me understand was my sister." What a coincidence. Gong Yimo was speechless. If only she was here. I really want to ask her why she hasn't sent a single letter for more than a year. Is she afraid? Or is she disgusted? I don't know. Every time I think about it, I feel extremely pained. He clenched his hand into a fist and gently knocked on his chest. Although there was a smile at the corner of his mouth, there was an unresolvable sadness around him, as though another soul was crying. His eyelashes fluttered as he closed his eyes. If she was here, I want to tell her that if the price of confessing is never to see her again, then I hope she can forget that day. I will also forget that day and let everything start anew. His words made Gong Yimo's heart move. Was he really willing to forget everything and start anew? Seeing that she was deep in thought, Gong Che stared at her with a burning gaze. In the depths of his eyes, there seemed to be a fire burning. Would he really forget everything and start anew? No, no, no. Only by tying her to his side would he have a chance. He was in too much pain, and he longed for it too much. He felt that he was going to die if he didn't have her by his side. So as long as she was by his side, even if he could see her every day, it would be a form of relief. So he showed his weakest side to the person in front of him, expressing all his sadness. He knew that Immerse was very free and easy, but she was also the most soft-hearted. She could be persuaded by reason, but not cowed by force. So as long as the person in front of him was her, she would definitely reveal a flaw. He had to carefully endure, for the sake of a result that he longed for. Gong Yimo was stared at by him. She didn't know why, but even though it was a heartwarming scene, she felt the hair on her back stand up. She shook her head and sighed. Your Highness is very affectionate.